Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind and step gently into the narrow canyon called the Seek, where rose-coloured walls rise hundreds of feet overhead, where ancient pathways lead to a treasury carved from solid stone, where a people who should not have succeeded built a civilization in the desert and then vanished so completely that for centuries their city existed only in legend. Each episode here isn't just about dates and battles, it's about the lives lived, the impossible challenges overcome, the knowledge preserved in stone when written records disappeared. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, a like and a subscribe help keep this channel alive. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. There is a place in the Jordanian desert where monumental facades emerge from cliffs of rose-coloured sandstone, their columns and pediments carved with such precision that even after 2,000 years they appear almost architectural drawings rendered in stone, almost impossibly perfect in their proportions and detail. The most famous of these is called the Treasury, though it never held treasure, a facade standing 40 metres high, decorated with Corinthian columns and carved reliefs showing figures from Greek and Egyptian mythology, emerging from the living rock as if the mountain itself had dreamed it into existence and then frozen the dream in stone. Behind the facade lies only a simple square chamber, empty now, perhaps always empty, the elaborate exterior, concealing nothing, pure display, architecture as statement rather than function, meant to impress, to announce wealth and power, to demonstrate mastery over stone and space. But the treasury is only the beginning, only the most famous of hundreds of such facades carved into the cliffs of a place called Petra, a city hidden in mountains, accessible only through a narrow canyon whose walls rise so high that sunlight barely reaches the floor, a place that seems designed by nature to be secret, to be defensible, to be impossible to conquer. The facades line the cliffs for kilometres, tombs mostly, carved for the elite of a civilization that thrived here for nearly 500 years, before vanishing so completely that for more than a millennium, Petra existed only in legend, the rose-red city, half as old as time, known to Bedouin tribes but forgotten by the wider world. The people who built Petra were called the Nabataeans, Arabs who emerged from the desert in the 4th century before the Common Era, who began as nomadic traders and camel herders, but who transformed themselves into sophisticated urban dwellers, who learned to carve stone and manage water, who grew wealthy beyond imagination by controlling the trade routes that carried frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia to the Mediterranean world. Their story should not have been possible. They built a major city in a place with no reliable water source, in desert mountains where agriculture was nearly impossible, in a location chosen for security rather than resources, sustained by technology and trade rather than by the fertile fields that supported other ancient cities. They succeeded against all logic, against all reasonable expectation, creating an urban civilization that at its peak housed perhaps 20,000 people in a landscape that today seems barely capable of supporting a few hundred, demonstrating engineering knowledge and organizational capacity that challenged assumptions about what desert peoples could achieve. And then they disappeared, absorbed by the Roman Empire in the year 106 of the Common Era. Their distinctive culture gradually erased, their language forgotten, their very existence fading from historical memory, until archaeologists and adventurers began rediscovering their monuments in the 19th century. The disappearance was not sudden or violent. The Nabataeans were not conquered in the traditional sense, did not suffer catastrophic military defeat, did not see their cities burned or their populations enslaved. Instead, they were peacefully annexed by Rome, incorporated into the empire as the province of Arabia Petraea, their elite co-opted, their merchants given Roman citizenship, their cities continuing to function, but now under different administration. But within a few generations, something essential was lost. The Nabataean script stopped being used, replaced by Greek and later Arabic. The distinctive pottery styles disappeared, supplanted by Roman wares. The temples fell silent, their gods abandoned or absorbed into the Roman pantheon. The knowledge of their sophisticated water systems was forgotten, the channels filled with sediment, The cisterns collapsed, the desert reclaiming what engineering had temporarily conquered. Classical sources barely mention them. Greek and Roman writers who documented the Mediterranean world in exhaustive detail devoted only occasional paragraphs to the Nabataeans, describing them as desert traders, as Arabs who lived in tents and moved with their herds, as people without permanent structures or written laws, as primitive nomads who somehow grew wealthy from controlling trade routes. These descriptions were wildly inaccurate, or at least incomplete, capturing perhaps the Nabataeans' origins but missing entirely what they had become. The transformation from nomadic traders to urban sophisticates, from tent dwellers to builders of monumental architecture, from illiterate tribesmen to authors of inscriptions in a distinctive script that blended Aramaic letters with their own innovations. The classical writers either did not know or did not care to record that the Nabataeans had developed hydraulic engineering that rivaled anything in the ancient world, that they had created hybrid, culture-blending Arab, Greek, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian elements, that they had built not just Petra but dozens of cities and settlements across a territory stretching from southern Syria to the Red Sea. When Petra was rediscovered by Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt in 1812, the world was astonished. Here was a major archaeological site that had been virtually unknown to European scholarship. A city of monuments that challenged assumptions about the capabilities of ancient Arab civilizations, evidence that complicated narratives about cultural superiority and the supposed necessity of Greek or Roman influence for architectural achievement. The rediscovery sparked questions that continue to resonate. Who exactly were the Nabataeans? Where did they come from? How did they learn to build such structures? What was the source of their wealth? Why did classical sources describe them so differently from what archaeology revealed? And perhaps most mysteriously, how did such a sophisticated civilization disappear so completely that even their name was forgotten? The hook was this. In the desert mountains of Jordan stood monuments to a people who succeeded where they should have failed, who thrived in conditions that should have been impossible, who created a culture that blended influences from across the ancient world, who grew wealthy beyond measure and then vanished almost without trace, leaving behind stone facades that revealed as much as they concealed, that answered some questions, while raising countless others, that stood as testament to achievements that scholars were only beginning to understand. Petra's rose-red cliffs held secrets about water and trade, about desert adaptation and cultural synthesis, about the rise and fall of civilizations that depended on conditions beyond their control, about how completely peoples can be forgotten when their languages die and their technologies are lost, about the difference between monuments that endure and cultures that disappear, leaving only stones to tell stories that no one living remembers how to read. The Nabataeans had built an impossible city and created a mysterious civilization. And both the city and the mystery waited in the desert, patient as stone, ready to reveal their secrets to those willing to walk through the narrow canyon, to see beyond the famous facades, to dig beneath the sand that covered streets and houses, to decipher inscriptions in a language that had to be recovered before it could be understood, to piece together from fragments the story of a people who had been forgotten, but who had once been masters of the desert and the trade routes that crossed it. The landscape that would become Petra was hostile to human habitation. A maze of sandstone mountains, carved by ancient water, flows into narrow canyons and towering cliffs, beautiful in its desolation, but offering little that could sustain life. Water was the critical absence. The region received perhaps 10 centimeters of rain per year, almost all falling during brief winter storms, running off the bare rock in flash floods that carved deeper channels but left nothing behind for the dry months that followed, evaporating before it could soak into ground or collect in natural pools. The mountains were composed of Nubian sandstone, layers deposited hundreds of millions of years ago when the region had been underwater, compressed and uplifted by geological forces, then sculpted by erosion into fantastic forms. Cliffs striped with colours ranging from deep red to pale yellow, surfaces weathered smooth or pitted into honeycomb patterns, caves and overhangs offering shelter but not sustenance. Vegetation was sparse, scrub brush and hardy plants that could survive on minimal moisture. Nothing that could support significant populations, no forests to provide timber, no grasslands for grazing, except in scattered wadis, where occasional rain collected, creating temporary oases that dried within weeks. It was not a place where any reasonable person would choose to build a city. It offered no obvious resources, no reliable water, no agricultural potential, nothing but rock and isolation, the geography ensuring that anyone who settled here would be dependent on trade and technology, rather than on the natural abundance that sustained most ancient cities. But the isolation was precisely the point. The mountains were defensible, the narrow canyons easily blocked, the approaches visible from heights where watchers could see approaching enemies hours before they arrived, the terrain favouring defenders who knew the paths over attackers who did not. And the location was strategic, sitting astride trade routes that connected the Arabian Peninsula to the Mediterranean, controlling the passages through which caravans had to travel if they wanted to avoid longer, more dangerous routes through open desert, positioned to exact tolls or provide services, or simply monitor the flow of goods that moved between regions. The Nabataeans, when they first arrived in this region sometime in the 4th century before the Common Era, were not city builders, but nomadic traders, Arabs whose origins remain obscure, but who appear to have emerged from the Arabian interior, moving north and west along trade routes, following opportunities, gradually establishing themselves as intermediaries and transporters, the people who knew the desert and could guide caravans safely through it. They lived in tents, as classical sources correctly noted, moving with their herds of camels and goats, maintaining temporary camps rather than permanent settlements. Their lifestyle adapted to desert conditions that made mobility more practical than fixed residence. But they were not primitive. They possessed specialized knowledge, understanding of desert navigation, of where water could be found, of which routes were passable at which seasons, of how to survive in conditions that killed outsiders, of camel husbandry, and the logistics of long-distance trade. They spoke Arabic, though they would eventually write in a modified form of Aramaic, the common language of commerce in the ancient Near East, adapting the script to represent their own language, creating a writing system that would serve them for 500 years before being forgotten and having to be deciphered by modern scholars. Their religion was distinctly Arab, centered on worship of deities like Dushara, a god associated with mountains and vegetation, and Al-Uzza, a goddess whose name meant the Mighty One, divine figures who would later be assimilated to Greek gods, but who had their origins in pre-Islamic Arabian tradition. The setting, then, was a desert frontier, a marginal region where established powers like the Ptolemies of Egypt, the Seleucids of Syria, and the Hasmonean Jews of Judea competed for influence, but exercised limited direct control, creating spaces where resourceful peoples could establish themselves, where trade was possible without the burden of imperial administration. The Nabataeans moved into this vacuum, filling roles that others could not or would not, becoming the people who made desert trade possible, who guided caravans, who provided security, who knew the routes and the terrain, who could be trusted because their reputation and future business depended on reliability. Their initial wealth came from controlling access to frankincense and myrrh, aromatic resins produced from trees that grew only in southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, substances that commanded extraordinary prices in Mediterranean markets, where they were burned as incense in temples, used in cosmetics and medicines, employed in burial preparations, demanded by religious ritual and elite consumption. The trade in aromatics was lucrative beyond measure. A camel load of frankincense, purchased cheaply in southern Arabia, could be sold in Gaza or Damascus for prices that represented hundreds of % markup, creating fortunes for those who controlled the supply chain, who could safely transport the goods across hundreds of kilometers of desert, who had the organization and resources to operate at the scale required. The Nabataeans positioned themselves to dominate this trade, not through conquest but through service, not by controlling the production regions but by controlling the routes, by becoming indispensable to merchants who needed to move goods from source to market, by establishing a reputation for reliability that made them preferred partners. As their wealth grew, so did their ambitions. Sometime in the late 4th or early 3rd century, they began the transformation from nomadic traders to settled urbanites, choosing the defensible mountain valleys around what would become Petra as their capital, beginning the process of adaptation that would turn desert Arabs into architects and hydraulic engineers. The setting was about to change, the barren mountains about to host one of the most remarkable urban developments of the ancient world, the landscape that offered nothing about to be transformed by human ingenuity into a thriving city, the nomadic traders about to become builders, the tents about to be replaced by carved stone, the temporary about to become permanent, or at least as permanent as anything human can be, in a world where civilizations rise and fall like the brief rains that sometimes fall on the desert and then evaporate as if they had never been. The discovery began with deception, with Johann Ludwig Burckhardt disguising himself as an Arab merchant, adopting the name Sheikh Ibrahim, learning Arabic and Islamic customs, preparing himself to penetrate regions where Europeans were viewed with suspicion or outright hostility. Burckhardt was a Swiss explorer working for the Association for Promoting the Discovery of the Interior Parts of Africa, preparing for an expedition up the Nile, spending years in the Middle East learning languages and customs, gathering information, building credibility that would allow him to travel where other Europeans could not. In August of 1812, while travelling through the region east of the Dead Sea, he heard rumours from local Bedouin about extraordinary ruins in the mountains, ancient structures carved from rock, a lost city that outsiders rarely visited, that was known to the tribes but remained unknown to European scholarship. The Bedouin were reluctant to take him there, suspicious of his interest, protective of sites they considered their own, but Burckhardt invented a pretext, claiming he needed to make a sacrifice at the tomb of Aaron, said to be located on a mountain near the ruins, appealing to religious obligation in ways that his adopted Muslim persona made credible. The guide agreed, and they set out on a journey that would lead through one of the most dramatic approaches to any ancient site. The narrow canyon, called the Sick, its walls rising more than 100 metres on either side, closing in places to less than 3 metres wide, twisting and turning so that the way ahead was never visible, creating the sense of entering something hidden, something secret, something meant to be protected. The Sick itself was impressive, its walls showing tool marks where the Nabataeans had widened, natural passages, channels carved into the cliff faces where they had directed water, niches where statues or inscriptions had once been placed, evidence of engineering and intention, proof that this was not just natural formation, but modified landscape, pathway shaped by human hands for human purposes. And then, at the end of the Sick, the treasury appeared. Revealed suddenly as the canyon opened, the elaborate facade emerging from the cliff in shades of rose and red, its columns and pediments impossibly refined for something carved from solid stone, its scale overwhelming, its preservation astonishing. Burckhardt had only minutes to observe it, his guide impatient, his cover story requiring him to press on toward the supposed tomb. But those minutes were enough to recognize that this was something extraordinary, that the rumors were true, that here in the desert, mountains existed architectural monuments of a sophistication that challenged everything European scholars believed about the capabilities of ancient Arab civilizations. He continued through the site, seeing more facades, carved tombs and temples, evidence of an extensive urban settlement, but always under the watchful eye of his guide, unable to explore freely, forced to maintain his pretense, taking mental notes that he would later record in his journal. When Burckhardt published his account in 1822, after his death from dysentery in Cairo at the age of 32, it created sensation. Here was a major archaeological site virtually unknown to Western scholarship, a lost city that seemed to emerge from legend, monuments that demanded explanation and investigation. Other travellers followed, artists and scholars and adventurers, drawn by Burckhardt's descriptions, producing drawings and paintings that circulated in Europe, creating romantic images of the rose-red city, capturing the exotic appeal of desert ruins, feeding Victorian fascination with the Orient. But serious archaeological investigation came slowly. The site's remoteness, the political instability of the region, the difficulty of working in desert conditions, all conspired to limit early research. Most visitors, content to sketch the facades and collect surface finds rather than conduct systematic excavation. It was not until the early 20th century that archaeologists began the slow work of understanding Petra, not just documenting its monuments, but excavating beneath the sand that covered streets and houses, uncovering pottery and inscriptions, tracing water channels and studying construction techniques, beginning to piece together who the Nabataeans had been and how they had created this impossible city. The German scholar Rudolf Ernst Bruno and his colleague Alfred von Domaszewski conducted the first systematic survey in 1897 and 1898, mapping the site, photographing monuments, recording inscriptions, creating the foundation for all subsequent research. British archaeologist George Horsfield worked at Petra in the 1920s and 30s, excavating temples and tombs, recovering pottery that would become crucial for dating and understanding Nabataean culture, publishing reports that began to reveal the complexity of the site beyond its famous facades. American archaeologists joined the effort in the 1950s and 60s, conducting more extensive excavations, applying developing techniques of stratigraphy and ceramic analysis, uncovering evidence of the water systems that had made the city possible, beginning to appreciate the engineering sophistication that underlay the architectural display. Each excavation revealed new surprises, the extent of the settlement far larger than the visible carved facades suggested, evidence of a city that had sprawled across the valley floor, houses and workshops and markets that had been built from more perishable materials and had collapsed, leaving less dramatic traces than the stone tombs but providing more information about daily life. The water systems were particularly astonishing, a network of channels, pipes, and cisterns that collected every drop of rain that fell on the surrounding mountains, that directed flash floods into storage, rather than allowing them to rush through and disappear, that made possible the gardens and fountains that ancient sources mentioned, that turned desert into urban centre through engineering that seemed almost impossible given the tools available to ancient peoples. Inscriptions appeared, carved into rock faces or scratched into pottery, written in Nabataean script, a language that had to be deciphered before it could reveal its secrets, texts that provided names of kings and gods, dedications and warnings, the voices of ancient Nabataeans speaking across millennia to those who learned to read their words. The discovery was ongoing, each generation of archaeologists adding to understanding, new techniques revealing details that earlier researchers had missed, remote sensing and ground-penetrating radar showing structures still buried, computer modelling reconstructing water flow and urban layout, the site gradually yielding its secrets to patient investigation. But mysteries remained, questions about origins and disappearance, about the relationship between the nomadic past and the urban present, about how the culture had evolved and why it had vanished, about what the elaborate facades actually meant to the people who carved them, about the beliefs and values that motivated such expenditure of labour on tombs and temples. The discovery of Petra was not a single moment, but a process, beginning with Burckhardt's glimpse through the deception of adopted identity, continuing through decades of exploration and excavation, extending into the present as archaeologists still working to understand a civilization that revealed itself in stone but concealed itself in silence, that left monuments but few written records, that built to impress but remained enigmatic, that emerged from the desert and returned to it, leaving behind facades that prompted more questions than they answered. The European response to Petra's rediscovery was immediate and intense, a mixture of romantic wonder and scholarly skepticism that revealed as much about 19th century attitudes as it did about the ancient Nabataeans. The artists arrived first, or at least their work reached the widest audiences most quickly. Painters like David Roberts, who travelled to Petra in 1839 and produced elaborate lithographs that captured the drama of the rose-red facades emerging from cliffs, the play of light on carved stone, the exotic appeal of desert ruins. Roberts's paintings emphasised the romantic and picturesque, adding dramatic lighting and tiny human figures to emphasise scale, creating images that fed Victorian fascination with the Orient, with lost civilizations, with archaeological discoveries that seemed to emerge from biblical and classical texts into tangible reality. The paintings circulated widely in Europe, exhibited in galleries, reproduced in books, creating a public image of Petra that emphasized its mystery and grandeur, that positioned it as one of the wonders of the ancient world, that made it famous even as serious scholarly understanding remained limited. But the Romantic enthusiasm was tempered by scholarly skepticism, by questions about who could have built such monuments, about whether the architectural sophistication could really be attributed to Arabs, about the relationship between the carved facades and the classical sources that described the Nabataeans as nomadic tent dwellers. Many European scholars, trained in traditions that placed Greece and Rome at the centre of civilization, struggled to accept that the Nabataeans had been independent innovators, that they had developed their own architectural traditions rather than simply copying from more advanced cultures. The facades showed clear Hellenistic influence, the columns and pediments following classical Greek orders, the decorative motifs borrowed from Mediterranean traditions, leading some scholars to argue that Greek architects must have designed the monuments, that the Nabataeans had been patrons but not creators, commissioners but not artists. This interpretation fit comfortably with assumptions about cultural hierarchy, about the supposed necessity of Greek or Roman influence for architectural achievement, about the inability of Semitic peoples to create sophisticated art without guidance from superior civilizations. The fact that the facades were carved rather than built became a point of discussion. Some scholars suggesting that carving was easier than construction, that it required less engineering knowledge, that the Nabataeans had achieved impressive visual effects through technique that was actually less sophisticated than true architecture. This was nonsense, as later analysis would prove. Carving facades from solid rock required precise planning, understanding of stone properties, ability to visualize and execute complex designs without the possibility of correction, skills that were in some ways more demanding than conventional building. But the bias persisted. The reluctance to credit Arab civilization with achievements that seemed to require the sophistication that European scholars associated only with classical antiquity. The response from Arab scholars and intellectuals was different, though often filtered through colonial power structures that limited their voices in international discourse. Pride in evidence of Arab civilization's antiquity and achievement, recognition that the Nabataeans represented indigenous development rather than mere imitation of foreign models. But there was also complexity. The Nabataeans were pre-Islamic Arabs, their religion and culture different from the Islamic civilization that had followed, creating questions about continuity and identity, about whether they should be claimed as ancestors or acknowledged as different peoples who happen to share linguistic and geographical connections. The response evolved as excavation progressed, as evidence accumulated that could not be easily dismissed or reinterpreted, as the sophistication of Nabataean engineering became undeniable, as inscriptions revealed a literate culture with its own distinctive script and language. The water systems particularly challenged assumptions, their sophistication exceeding anything comparable in the ancient world, demonstrating knowledge of hydraulics and hydrology that could not be attributed to Greek or Roman influence, because it predated significant contact with those civilizations, because it represented indigenous innovation adapted to desert conditions that Mediterranean peoples had little experience with. The pottery, too, showed distinctive Nabataean traditions, the painted decoration following Arab rather than Hellenistic patterns, the forms adapted to local functions and aesthetic preferences, evidence of cultural independence, even as the Nabataeans borrowed and adapted elements from neighbours. The inscriptions, when they began to be deciphered in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, revealed a language that was Arabic, written in Aramaic-derived script, a hybrid that reflected the Nabataeans' position between cultures, their participation in broader Near Eastern commercial and intellectual networks while maintaining distinctive identity. Still, skepticism persisted about specific claims, about population estimates that seemed too large for a desert city, about the extent of Nabataean territory, about their political organization and administrative capacity, about whether they had really been as wealthy and powerful as the monuments suggested. Critics pointed out that the elaborate facades might represent elite expenditure that did not reflect broader economic reality, that tomb monuments always exaggerated in ancient cultures, that the visible remains might create misleading impressions about the civilization's actual scale and importance. These were valid methodological concerns, warnings against reading too much from architectural display, cautions about assuming that monumental building reflected general prosperity rather than elite concentration of wealth. But as excavation continued, as evidence of the broader settlement emerged, as the water systems and urban infrastructure were mapped, it became clear that Petra had indeed been a major city, that its population had numbered in the tens of thousands at peak, that the Nabataeans had built not just impressive tombs, but an entire urban civilization. The response also included commercial exploitation. Local Bedouin, who had always known of the ruins, now found European and American tourists willing to pay for guides, for food and lodging, for protection and transportation, creating economy around the archaeological site that both preserved and threatened it. Artifacts were collected, sometimes systematically for museums, often haphazardly for private collections, inscriptions photographed, but also sometimes damaged by visitors, carving their own names alongside ancient texts. The tension between preservation and accessibility, creating problems that continue to the present. The wonder remained constant even as skepticism evolved, each visitor emerging from the Seek to see the treasury experiencing the same astonishment that Burckhardt had felt, the same sense of encountering something extraordinary, something that transcended normal categories and demanded explanation. Petra became symbol of lost civilizations, of desert mysteries, of the survival of monuments when cultures disappear, of the gap between what we can see and what we can understand, of stones that speak, but in languages we must learn to interpret. The first response, in all its complexity and contradiction, set patterns that would persist: romantic enthusiasm and scholarly caution, appreciation and appropriation, wonder and skepticism existing side by side, the rose-red city becoming famous even as the people who built it remained enigmatic, the facades capturing imaginations even as the culture that produced them resisted easy interpretation. The Nabataeans had announced themselves to the modern world through monuments that could not be ignored, but they had not made themselves easily understood. They had left traces that prompted questions, but few answers, that revealed their capabilities, but concealed their motivations, that demonstrated their sophistication, but maintained their mystery. Stone facades that were simultaneously windows and walls, revealing and concealing, speaking and silent, waiting for patient investigation to decode what wonder alone could never comprehend. The ancient sources told one story about the Nabataeans, describing them as nomadic Arabs who lived in tents, who rejected permanent structures, who maintained traditional desert lifestyle even as they grew wealthy from trade, who were fierce warriors and shrewd merchants, but who remained essentially uncivilized by Greek and Roman standards. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, described the Nabataeans as a people who did not build houses, who would impose fines on anyone who attempted permanent construction, who moved constantly with their herds, who accumulated wealth but refused to adopt settled life. He portrayed them as democratic in governance, making decisions communally, sharing resources equally, maintaining egalitarian traditions that prevented concentration of power or wealth, living according to customs that seemed admirable in their simplicity, even as they participated in sophisticated commercial networks. Diodorus Siculus, another Greek historian, described similar patterns, emphasizing Nabataean rejection of agriculture, their reliance on herding and trade, their fierce independence and resistance to conquest, their ability to survive in desert conditions that would kill less adapted peoples. These descriptions created a picture of noble savages, Arabs who had maintained traditional purity while engaging with civilized world, who were wealthy but not corrupted by wealth, who participated in commerce but remained outside the urban degeneracy that Greeks and Romans associated with civilization. The sources were not entirely wrong. They captured something of Nabataean origins, of the nomadic past from which the culture had emerged, of values and practices that may have persisted even as material conditions changed. But they missed the transformation, the shift from nomadic to urban life that had occurred by the time these texts were written, the development of Petra and other cities that contradicted claims about rejection of permanent structures, the architectural sophistication that belied descriptions of simple desert dwellers. The contradiction between text and archaeology was stark. The ancient sources described people who lived in tents. The ruins showed monumental architecture carved from stone. The sources emphasized nomadic mobility. The archaeological evidence revealed urban infrastructure designed for permanent settlement. The sources claimed the Nabataeans rejected agriculture. Excavation found terraced gardens and irrigation systems. How to reconcile these contradictions? Several explanations presented themselves, none entirely satisfactory, all containing elements of truth. Perhaps the classical writers were describing earlier periods, capturing Nabataean culture before urbanization, preserving accounts from times when the people had indeed been nomadic, before wealth from trade had enabled and encouraged settled life. Their descriptions accurate for the past but outdated for the present. This explanation had merit. The Nabataeans certainly had nomadic origins. Their culture retained elements of desert tradition even after urbanization, but it failed to account for the fact that some descriptions, particularly Strabo's, were written when Petra was already well established as urban centre, when the transformation should have been visible to observers. Perhaps the writers were describing the general population while missing the elite, focusing on common Nabataeans who may have continued nomadic lifestyle even as wealthy merchants and rulers built cities, capturing majority experience while overlooking the monumental projects that would dominate archaeological record. This too had some validity. Petra's elaborate tombs were clearly elite constructions, not reflecting average Nabataean experience, but excavation had revealed extensive urban settlement, housing and infrastructure that suggested substantial permanent population, not just royal enclave in otherwise nomadic society. Perhaps the writers were projecting stereotypes, seeing what they expected to see in Arab peoples, describing Nabataeans through lens of preconceptions about nomadic barbarians, emphasizing aspects that fit classical categories while ignoring complexities that would challenge those categories. This explanation was probably closest to truth. Greek and Roman ethnography frequently distorted reality to fit literary conventions, emphasizing the exotic and primitive, creating portraits that served rhetorical purposes rather than accurately describing observed reality. The Nabataeans may have deliberately maintained certain nomadic traditions, keeping tents for seasonal use, preserving herding practices alongside urban life, performing their identity as desert Arabs even while building stone cities, creating hybrid culture that was simultaneously nomadic and urban, traditional and innovative. This would explain why classical writers could describe tent dwelling, while archaeologists find cities, why sources emphasize mobility while ruins show permanence, why texts and stones seem to describe entirely different peoples when they were actually describing different aspects of single, complex culture. Another contradiction concerned wealth and display, the sources emphasizing Nabataean wealth from trade, describing their control of aromatics commerce, acknowledging their prosperity, but then claiming they lived simply, without ostentation, maintaining desert egalitarianism. The monuments contradicted this completely. The elaborate carved facades represented enormous expenditure of labor and resources. The water systems required massive coordinated efforts. The scale of urban development indicated concentration of wealth and power far beyond any simple egalitarian society. Perhaps the contradiction reflected Nabataean values, wealth accumulated but not displayed in conventional ways. Resources invested in communal infrastructure, like water systems, rather than in individual palaces. Prosperity expressed through tomb monuments that honored dead, rather than through luxurious living quarters that would have made elite appear different from common people. The carved facades, then, were not entirely at odds with claims of simplicity. They were expressions of wealth that maintained certain egalitarian ideals, monuments for the dead that did not create living disparities, display that was permitted in burial but discouraged in life. Or perhaps the contradiction simply reflected change over time, early Nabataean egalitarianism giving way to hierarchy as wealth grew, nomadic values eroding as urbanization progressed, the society that Strabo described as democratic and equal becoming the kingdom that later, sources acknowledged, ruled by kings whose power was absolute and whose tombs dominated the landscape. The contradictions revealed the difficulty of knowing the past, the gaps between what texts say and what archaeology shows, between how peoples describe themselves and how outsiders perceive them, between values espoused and behaviors practiced, between origins and developments, between what endures in stone and what is recorded in words. The Nabataeans appeared different depending on which sources you consulted, which evidence you privileged, which contradictions you chose to emphasize or resolve. They were simultaneously nomadic and urban, simple and sophisticated, egalitarian and hierarchical, traditional and innovative, Arab and Hellenized, mysterious precisely because they resisted simple categorization, because they existed in spaces between cultures, and defied the frameworks that observers tried to impose. The contradictions could not be entirely resolved, only acknowledged, accepted as evidence that the Nabataeans were more complex than any single narrative could capture, that the rose-red city and the desert tents both told truths about a people who moved between worlds, who transformed themselves while maintaining elements of what they had been, who built in stone while remembering the mobility that had made them who they were. The fundamental questions about the Nabataeans seemed straightforward, but proved maddeningly difficult to answer with certainty. Who were they? Where did they come from? How did they transform from desert nomads into sophisticated urbanites? And why did they disappear so completely? For some scholars, particularly early researchers influenced by biblical archaeology, the Nabataeans were essentially Edomites, descendants of the kingdom that had occupied this region before them, inheritors of earlier Semitic traditions, who had adopted Arab language and customs, but who represented continuity rather than replacement. This theory emphasized archaeological evidence of earlier occupation, the existence of settlements predating Nabataean arrival, the possibility that the newcomers had assimilated rather than displaced previous inhabitants, creating hybrid culture that blended old and new. The theory had appeal because it provided historical depth, connected the Nabataeans to biblical narratives about Edom and Esau, created continuity that made the sudden appearance of sophisticated civilization seem less mysterious, explained architectural and engineering knowledge as inherited rather than independently developed. But critics noted that the Nabataeans spoke Arabic, not the northwest Semitic language of the Edomites, that they worshipped different gods, followed different customs, identified themselves explicitly as Arabs in their inscriptions, that evidence for continuity was weak, while evidence for cultural distinctiveness was strong. Another theory proposed that the Nabataeans originated from southern Arabia, migrating northward along trade routes, bringing with them knowledge of frankincense production and trading practices, establishing themselves in Petra because of its strategic position astride commerce between Arabia and the Mediterranean. This theory explained their involvement in aromatics trade, their Arabic language, their desert adaptation, their initial appearance in historical sources as traders and camel herders, their cultural connections to broader Arabian traditions. The southern origin theory aligned with evidence from inscriptions and pottery that showed connections to Arabian Peninsula, with religious practices that paralleled those known from South Arabian cultures, with a timing of their appearance that coincided with expansion of frankincense trade in the Hellenistic period. But it struggled to explain how nomadic traders acquired sophisticated engineering knowledge, architectural skills, and administrative capacity necessary for urban civilization, how they learned to carve facades and manage water systems, how they developed writing and legal traditions. Some scholars argued that the architectural and engineering knowledge came from outside, that the Nabataeans hired Greek or Phoenician craftsmen, that the monuments reflected borrowed expertise rather than indigenous innovation, that the sophistication was imported rather than developed. This theory rested on assumptions about cultural capacity, about which peoples could innovate and which could only imitate, about necessity of Mediterranean influence for achievement, assumptions that increasingly seemed more ideological than evidential. Archaeological evidence showed that Nabataean architecture, while incorporating Hellenistic elements, was distinctively hybrid, that the carved facades combined Greek columns with Egyptian motifs and Arab traditions, that the water systems showed indigenous adaptation to local conditions, that the overall synthesis was unique rather than derivative. Other theories focused on the source of Nabataean wealth, debating whether it came primarily from trade in goods they transported, or from taxation of merchants who used their routes, from active commerce, or from passive extraction, from entrepreneurial activity, or from strategic position. The distinction mattered because it affected understanding of Nabataean society. Traders would have developed different skills and institutions than toll collectors, Active merchants would have different relationships with distant regions than gatekeepers controlling passages. Evidence suggested both were true, that Nabataeans engaged in trade themselves while also charging fees for security and access, that they transported some goods while taxing others, that their wealth derived from multiple sources that reinforced each other, creating prosperity that was robust because it was diversified. Another debate concerned political organization, whether the Nabataeans were truly independent kingdom, client state of larger powers, whether their kings ruled absolutely or were constrained by councils or assemblies, whether governance was centralized or federal, unitary or tribal. Classical sources suggested early Nabataean democracy or collective leadership. Later inscriptions clearly indicated monarchy with divine pretensions, raising questions about when and how political transformation occurred, what drove centralization, how power became concentrated. Some scholars proposed that urbanization necessitated centralization, that managing cities required administrative hierarchy that nomadic organization could not provide, that kings emerged because settled life demanded them, that monarchy was consequence rather than cause of transformation. Others suggested external pressure drove centralization, that threats from Seleucids, Hasmoneans, and eventually Romans forced Nabataeans to develop stronger political structures, that kings arose to coordinate defense and diplomacy, that military necessity created monarchical authority. The timing of disappearance also generated theories. Some argued that Roman annexation destroyed Nabataean culture deliberately, that imperial policy aimed at Romanization, that the distinctive language and customs were suppressed, that integration into empire meant cultural death. But evidence showed peaceful incorporation, Nabataean elite receiving Roman citizenship, cities continuing to function, no signs of destruction or persecution, suggesting that disappearance was gradual assimilation rather than violent suppression. Alternative theories proposed economic causes, that shifting trade routes made Petra less important, that development of Red Sea maritime commerce reduced overland traffic, that the Nabataeans' economic foundation eroded, that poverty followed wealth, that cultural vitality depended on prosperity that no longer existed. This explained why the culture disappeared without violence, why cities were gradually abandoned rather than destroyed, why the population dispersed rather than being displaced, why memory faded as economic relevance declined. Environmental theories suggested that climate change or water system failure contributed to abandonment, that the sophisticated hydrology that made Petra possible became too expensive to maintain, that earthquakes or gradual environmental degradation made desert cities unsustainable, that people left because conditions deteriorated rather than because Rome forced them. Each theory contained partial truth. None explained everything. The reality likely involved multiple factors interacting in complex ways: urban transformation and political centralization, and economic shifts and environmental changes, and Roman annexation, all contributing to rise and fall, creating patterns that no single explanation could capture. The debates would continue. Evidence never quite sufficient to prove any theory definitively, the Nabataeans remaining enigmatic precisely because they left enough traces to generate questions, but not enough to answer them completely, because the stones spoke, but the voices were distant and difficult to understand, because the rose-red facades announced presence but maintained mystery, revealing themselves while concealing the people who made them. The truth about the Nabataeans emerged slowly from sand and stone, pieced together by generations of archaeologists who returned year after year to Petra and other sites, each expedition adding fragments of understanding, each discovery raising new questions, the investigation ongoing and incomplete even after more than a century of systematic research. The water systems were among the first major revelations, recognition that the elaborate facades were only the visible portion of much more sophisticated infrastructure, that the Nabataeans' greatest achievement was not carving stone, but managing water in a desert where survival depended on capturing every drop that fell. Archaeologists mapping the site in the early 20th century began tracing channels carved into cliff faces, pipes made from terracotta sections fitted together, cisterns hewn from rock, dams built across wadis to slow flash floods, the components of a comprehensive system that collected, stored, and distributed water throughout the year. The system's sophistication exceeded anything comparable in the ancient world, demonstrating understanding of hydrology and hydraulics that seemed almost modern, knowledge of catchment and gradient, filtration and pressure, storage capacity, and distribution networks. One channel, called the Wadi Musa pipeline, brought water from a spring 8 kilometers away, following the contours of the landscape to maintain steady gradient, incorporating settling tanks to remove sediment, using ceramic pipes that could withstand pressure and were easily replaced when sections damaged. Other channels collected runoff from surrounding mountains, directing it into cisterns that could hold hundreds of thousands of litres, storing winter rains for use during dry months, ensuring reliable supply for population and gardens that otherwise could not have existed. The dam at the Sikh entrance was particularly clever, diverting the wadi that naturally flowed through the narrow canyon, preventing flash floods from destroying the city while capturing the water for storage, protecting infrastructure while maximizing resource collection. Excavations revealed that houses throughout the city had been connected to the water system, that ordinary residences had running water delivered through pipes, that fountains and public baths existed, that the Nabataeans had enjoyed amenities that would not be common again until modern era. The investigation of Nabataean pottery provided another dimension of understanding. The distinctive painted wares allowing archaeologists to date sites and trace trade connections, to identify Nabataean presence across a broad territory, to understand how the culture spread and evolved. The pottery was characterized by fine red ware with painted decoration in geometric and floral patterns, produced to high standards with thin walls and careful finishing, distinctively Nabataean, yet showing influences from multiple traditions, evidence of cultural synthesis and artistic innovation. Chemical analysis revealed that pottery was produced at multiple centres, that workshops existed not just at Petra but at other Nabataean cities, that production was organised and standardised, suggesting centralised control, or at least shared technical traditions, evidence of economic integration across the kingdom. The distribution of Nabataean pottery extended far beyond their core territory, appearing at sites throughout the Levant, in Egypt, on Mediterranean islands, even at locations in Italy and Spain, physical evidence of trade networks that connected Petra to broader ancient world. Inscriptions provided the most direct connection to Nabataean voices, texts carved into tombs and temples, scratched onto pottery, written on papyrus fragments that occasionally survived in desert conditions, preserving names and dedications, legal formulas, and religious invocations. The script was cursive, Aramaic adapted to write Arabic, creating hybrid that served Nabataean needs for several centuries before being replaced by Greek under Roman rule. The characters distinctive enough to be immediately recognizable, similar enough to other Aramaic scripts to be decipherable once key texts were identified. Early inscriptions were brief and formulaic, naming tomb owners, invoking gods, warning against disturbance, providing minimal information but establishing presence, proving that Nabataeans wrote and how they wrote. Later inscriptions became more elaborate, recording royal dedications of temples, documenting legal transactions, preserving administrative records, offering glimpses into governance and religion, social, structure, and values, though always tantalizingly brief, never providing the extensive textual record that would answer all questions. The investigation gradually revealed the extent of Nabataean territory, surveys identifying sites throughout southern Jordan, southern Syria, northern Arabia, the Negev, each location showing distinctive architectural and ceramic signatures, confirming that the Nabataeans controlled not just Petra, but a network of cities and settlements. Excavations at Madain Saleh in Saudi Arabia, the second great Nabataean city, revealed monumental facades similar to Petra's but in different sandstone, inscriptions in Nabataean and early Arabic scripts, tombs dated by inscription to specific kings, providing independent confirmation of historical chronology and cultural continuity. Sites in the Negev showed agricultural development, settlements that grew grapes and raised livestock in marginal desert environments, using water harvesting techniques similar to those at Petra but adapted to different conditions, evidence of environmental knowledge applied across varied landscapes. The investigation included experimental archaeology, attempts to reconstruct Nabataean techniques, to understand how they carved the facades, how they manufactured pottery, how their water systems functioned, testing hypotheses through practical replication. Carving experiments showed that the facades were created from top down, workers suspended on ropes, using iron tools to rough out shapes, then bronze and stone implements for finer detail, understanding of stone properties preventing splits and cracks, knowledge acquired through practice and passed through generations of specialized craftsmen. Water system reconstruction demonstrated that Nabataean engineering was not just impressive but functional, that the channels and cisterns worked as designed, that the systems could have supplied urban population with adequate water, that the desert city was genuinely sustainable as long as infrastructure was maintained. The investigation combined multiple disciplines: archaeology and epigraphy, art history and hydrology, ceramics and chemistry, linguistics and climate science, each contributing perspectives and methods, creating comprehensive understanding that no single approach could achieve. Modern technology added new capabilities: satellite imagery revealing structures invisible from ground, ground-penetrating radar detecting buried features without excavation, three-dimensional scanning documenting facades before erosion claimed them, creating digital archives that would survive even if originals did not. But challenges remained. Most of the site still unexcavated, sediment covering streets and buildings, funds and permissions limiting what could be investigated, tensions between archaeological research and tourism management, between preservation and accessibility, between international scholars and Jordanian authorities claiming heritage rights. The investigation was incomplete and would likely remain so. The Nabataeans revealing themselves gradually, answering some questions while raising others, the stone facades giving up their secrets reluctantly to patient research, the desert city maintaining elements of mystery even as understanding grew, pieces of truth assembled into patterns that approximated but never quite captured the full complexity of what the Nabataeans had been. The evidence lay scattered across museums and storage facilities: fragments of pottery and scraps of inscriptions, coins bearing forgotten kings' names, and architectural elements that had fallen from carved facades, each piece, insignificant alone, but collectively composing a portrait of the Nabataeans that was incomplete, but genuine, partial, but real. The pottery was the most abundant evidence. Thousands of sherds recovered from every excavation, the distinctive red ware, with painted decoration immediately recognizable to trained eyes, its presence marking Nabataean occupation or trade, its evolution through time, providing chronological framework for understanding the civilization's development. The finest wares were extraordinarily thin, walls barely 2 millimeters thick, smooth and highly polished, decorated with geometric patterns or floral motifs, executed in black or dark red paint, technical achievement that required sophisticated understanding of clay preparation, wheel throwing, and firing temperatures. The painted decoration followed distinctive patterns, zones of triangles and cross-hatching, palmets and rosettes, arrangements that were uniquely Nabataean even as they incorporated motifs from multiple traditions. Arab and Hellenistic and Egyptian influences synthesized into coherent aesthetic that belonged entirely to this culture. Chemical analysis revealed that potters used local clays but added specific mineral tempers to improve workability and firing properties, that they understood relationships between composition and performance, that pottery production was not casual but sophisticated craft, practiced by specialists working within established traditions. The distribution patterns showed that Nabataean pottery circulated widely, appearing at sites throughout their territory and beyond, evidence of trade or gift exchange, of cultural influence extending across regions, of economic integration that connected distant settlements into single commercial network. The coins provided direct evidence of political history, small bronze and silver pieces bearing names of Nabataean kings in Greek and Nabataean scripts, images of rulers and gods, dates that allowed precise chronological placement, physical proof of sovereignty, and royal succession. The earliest Nabataean coins appeared in the late 2nd century before the Common Era, minted under King Aretas II, simple designs showing kings' portraits and deity image, inscriptions, identifying ruler and asserting authority, creating official record that supplemented the fragmentary mentions in classical sources. Later coins became more elaborate, incorporating Greek and Roman motifs alongside Nabataean elements, adapting to aesthetic preferences of Mediterranean world while maintaining distinctive identity, numismatic evidence of cultural negotiation and adaptation. The coins circulated beyond Nabataean territory, found in hoards and excavations throughout the Levant, physical testimony to trade connections, evidence that Nabataean currency was accepted in regional markets, that their economic power translated into monetary authority. The inscriptions were perhaps the most precious evidence, texts that preserved actual Nabataean language, voices speaking directly across millennia, though always frustratingly brief, never providing the extensive literary or historical records that would answer all questions. Most inscriptions were funerary, carved into tomb facades, naming deceased and sometimes family members, invoking gods to protect the burial, warning against disturbance with curses that blended legal threats and religious sanctions. A typical inscription might read, "This is the tomb which made Dushara for himself and his children and descendants forever. Blessed be Dushara, the God of our Lord, and cursed be anyone who opens this tomb or removes anyone from it or disturbs the bones." The formula revealed Nabataean values, emphasis on family and continuity, faith in gods who protected sacred spaces, concern about tomb violation that was common enough to require explicit warnings, language that was formal but accessible, religious but also practical. Some inscriptions recorded temple dedications, documenting royal or elite piety, preserving names of kings and gods, providing rare glimpses into religious practices and political authority, though always in formulaic language that revealed less than historians wished. The architectural evidence was most visible, but also most ambiguous. The carved facades impressive but difficult to interpret, their meanings not obvious, their purposes beyond burial uncertain, their styles raising questions about who designed them and what they were meant to communicate. The facades followed several types, from simple gable-fronted tombs to elaborate compositions with multiple stories, columns, pediments, decorative elements combining Greek architectural orders with Egyptian and Mesopotamian motifs, creating hybrid styles that were distinctively Nabataean. The treasury, the most famous facade, incorporated Corinthian columns, Ionic capitals, Egyptian-style niches, and sculptural elements showing Greek deities and Nabataean symbols, the whole composition demonstrating sophisticated understanding of classical architecture, but adapting it in ways that were uniquely their own. The facades were not functional architecture but symbolic, the carved elements representing columns and beams that served no structural purpose. Architecture as representation rather than construction, decoration rather than engineering, though the precision of carving demonstrated technical mastery that was undeniable. Tool marks preserved in stone showed how the work was done, rough shaping with iron picks and chisels, finer detail with bronze implements, final smoothing with abrasives, evidence of process that was labour-intensive but not mysterious, skilled but not supernatural, human achievement rather than divine intervention. The water system components provided evidence of engineering sophistication, ceramic pipes with fitted joints, channels cut with precise gradients, cisterns with plastered interiors to prevent seepage, dams incorporating both functional and architectural elements, infrastructure that was elegant in its efficiency. Analysis of pipe fragments showed standardized production, sections made to consistent dimensions that allowed interchangeability, modular system that facilitated repairs and extensions, evidence of planning and organization that characterized sophisticated urban infrastructure. The plaster used to line cisterns and seal joints contained specific mineral additives that made it water-resistant, knowledge of hydraulic cement that was sophisticated for the period, technical expertise that paralleled Roman concrete but developed independently, evidence of indigenous innovation in response to local needs. Organic remains provided evidence of diet and environment, charred seeds and animal bones, showing what Nabataeans ate, pollen and plant remains, revealing what grew in their gardens, isotope analysis, indicating where people and animals came from, scientific data supplementing archaeological context. The evidence showed diet based on barley and wheat, lentils and chickpeas, dates and grapes, sheep and goat, occasional beef and game, patterns typical of Eastern Mediterranean but adapted to desert conditions. Agricultural production in marginal environment made possible by sophisticated irrigation. The evidence was fragmentary, incomplete, often ambiguous, requiring careful interpretation and cross-referencing. But it was real, physical testimony to Nabataean existence, proof that could not be dismissed or explained away, material remains that demanded explanation and rewarded patient study. Each fragment told partial story: pottery about trade and taste, coins about politics and economy, inscriptions about language and belief, architecture about technical capacity and aesthetic preferences, water systems about engineering knowledge and environmental adaptation, together composing portrait that was necessarily incomplete, but genuinely informative, revealing the Nabataeans as they had been, not completely but truly, in fragments that accumulated into understanding. Beneath the obvious questions about who the Nabataeans were and where they came from, beneath the visible achievements of carved facades and urban development, there lay a deeper mystery about the true source of their success, about what made them exceptional among ancient peoples. The deeper truth was that the Nabataeans' greatest achievement was not architectural or commercial, but technological. Not what they built, but what they knew. Not the monuments that survived, but the knowledge that died with them. Understanding of desert hydrology that was so sophisticated it would not be matched again for more than 1,000 years. The carved facades that tourists photograph, the treasury that appears on countless postcards, the monumental tombs that define Petra in popular imagination, these were consequences rather than causes of Nabataean success, displays of wealth rather than sources of it, impressive but ultimately secondary to the invisible infrastructure that made desert civilization possible. The water systems were the foundation of everything else, the technology that allowed 20,000 people to live in a place that could naturally support perhaps a few hundred, the purse, engineering that turned barren mountains into urban center, the knowledge that transformed liability into asset by capturing and storing the brief rains that fell on surrounding heights. But the sophistication of these systems was not immediately obvious. Channels carved into cliff faces looked simple, cisterns hewn from rock seemed straightforward, dams blocking wadis appeared crude, the engineering hidden in details of gradient and volume, capacity and distribution, calculations and measurements that left no written record. Modern hydrologists studying the systems discovered that they incorporated principles that would not be formally articulated until Renaissance. Understanding of hydraulic pressure and flow rates, knowledge of catchment ratios and storage capacity, appreciation of how terrain and climate interacted to create opportunities for water collection. The Nabataeans knew, without benefit of modern instruments or mathematical formulations, how much rain fell on specific areas, how much of that rain could be captured, how much storage was needed to sustain given population through dry seasons, how to calculate gradients that would maintain flow without causing erosion, how to design overflow systems that prevented flood damage. This knowledge was practical rather than theoretical, developed through observation and experimentation rather than abstract calculation, but it was no less sophisticated for being empirical, perhaps more remarkable for having been achieved without the conceptual frameworks that modern engineers take for granted. The deeper mystery was how they acquired this knowledge, who first recognized that desert could be made habitable through water management, who developed the techniques that were then transmitted through generations, who made the observations and calculations that allowed such sophisticated systems to be designed. There were no textbooks, no engineering manuals, no written records explaining the principles or documenting the methods. The knowledge existed only in practice, in the physical systems themselves, and in the training that master craftsmen gave to apprentices, oral tradition, and hands-on learning rather than written instruction. When the Nabataean civilization declined, when cities were gradually abandoned, when the population dispersed and assimilated into broader Roman, then Byzantine, then Islamic societies, this knowledge was lost. The water systems fell into disrepair, channels blocked with sediment, pipes broken and not replaced, cisterns collapsed, dams breached. Within a few generations, No one remembered how the systems had been built or maintained. The skills that had sustained desert cities for 500 years vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving only the physical remains whose purposes could be recognized, but whose principles could no longer be applied. This pattern of loss was not unique to the Nabataeans. It characterized the fate of much ancient knowledge, technical expertise that was practical rather than theoretical, that existed in practice rather than in texts, that could be forgotten when the communities that maintained it disappeared. Roman concrete formulations were lost for more than 1,000 years. After the empire's fall, Damascus steel techniques vanished in the medieval period. Greek fire's composition became secret, that died with those who knew it. In each case, sophisticated technology disappearing because knowledge was not adequately recorded or transmitted. But the Nabataean water knowledge was perhaps more remarkable than these other losses because it represented not just technical skill but deep understanding of environmental systems, not just ability to implement designs but capacity to adapt to local conditions, to read landscape and climate, to work with natural forces rather than against them. The deeper mystery extended to their commercial success, the question of how they maintained monopoly on frankincense trade for centuries, how they prevented competitors from developing alternative routes or breaking into their networks, how they sustained commercial dominance without military power sufficient to enforce it through conquest. The classical sources emphasized Nabataean wealth from trade, but never fully explained the mechanisms of control, how they ensured that merchants used their routes, paid their fees, followed their regulations, how they maintained order across desert territories that were difficult to police, how they prevented banditry and ensured security without the large standing armies that other ancient states required. Part of the answer lay in the water itself. The Nabataeans controlled not just routes but resources, the springs and cisterns that caravans needed to survive desert crossings, the knowledge of where water could be found, the infrastructure that made particular paths feasible, creating dependency that was more reliable than military coercion. Merchants who wanted to cross the desert safely needed Nabataean cooperation, needed access to water sources and rest stations, needed guides who knew the terrain, needed assurance that they would not be robbed or abandoned. The Nabataeans provided these services, and in providing them controlled the commerce, monopoly based not on force but on indispensability. Another dimension of the deeper mystery concerned the cultural synthesis that characterized Nabataean civilization, the way they borrowed from multiple traditions, Arab and Greek and Egyptian and Mesopotamian, yet created something distinctive, hybrid culture that was more than some of its influences. Most ancient peoples who borrowed from neighbors either maintained clear cultural boundaries, preserving their own traditions while adopting specific foreign elements, or were assimilated entirely, losing distinctive identity as they integrated into dominant culture. The Nabataeans did neither. They borrowed extensively, incorporated elements from every culture they encountered through trade, yet maintained clearly Nabataean identity, spoke Arabic, written in adapted Aramaic script, worshipped Arab gods while building temples in Hellenistic styles, produced pottery that showed multiple influences, yet remained distinctively their own. This cultural flexibility, this ability to borrow without losing identity, to adapt without assimilating, was unusual and may explain their commercial success. Merchants who could operate across cultural boundaries, who could speak multiple languages and follow different customs, who could be Arab in Arabia and Hellenized in Mediterranean markets, who could translate not just words but cultural expectations. But the mechanism of this synthesis remained mysterious. How did they decide what to borrow and what to preserve? Who made these choices? How were they transmitted and maintained? How did culture remain coherent while incorporating so many foreign elements? How did they avoid the fragmentation that usually accompanied such extensive borrowing? The deeper mystery was ultimately about knowledge and its transmission, about what is lost when civilizations disappear, about the gap between what can be seen in ruins and what was known by the living, about technologies and understandings that leave minimal physical traces, but that were essential to how peoples succeeded. The Nabataeans left impressive monuments, the facades that made Petra famous. But their true legacy was knowledge that mostly vanished, water engineering that died with practitioners, commercial practices that were not recorded, cultural synthesis techniques that were never explained, understanding of desert and trade, of adaptation and survival that could not be recovered from stone alone. The Rose-Red City testified to their capabilities, but concealed their knowledge, announced their presence but maintained their secrets, revealed what they had achieved while hiding how they had done it, leaving behind mysteries that were deeper and more significant than the visible monuments, questions about lost knowledge and vanished expertise, about what peoples knew and how they knew it, about the fragility of understanding and the ease with which it could be forgotten. The turning point in Nabataean history came not suddenly but gradually during the reign of Aretas III, who ruled from approximately 87 to 62 years before the Common Era, the king who transformed a loose confederation of trading clans into a centralized kingdom, who turned Petra from camp into capital, who made the decision that would define his people for the next 2 centuries. Before Aretas, the Nabataeans had been successful traders, but not empire builders, wealthy merchants, but not settled urbanites, controlling routes but not territory, maintaining influence through commercial relationships rather than political authority. Arab nomads who had found profitable niche but had not fundamentally transformed themselves. Aretas changed this, though the transformation he initiated was not instantaneous but unfolded over decades, as decisions about infrastructure and administration, about water management and urban planning, created momentum that could not be reversed, that committed the Nabataeans to settled life and all its consequences. The choice to build permanent structures at Petra was the critical decision, requiring investments that made no sense if the population might move, creating fixed assets that needed protection, establishing infrastructure that tied people to place in ways that nomadic lifestyle never had. The water systems were particularly significant, their construction requiring massive coordinated labour, thousands of workers chiselling channels into cliffs, excavating cisterns from solid rock, building dams across wadis, projects that took years or decades to complete, that would only pay off if the city remained occupied long enough to justify the investment. Once built, the water systems became reason to stay, the infrastructure itself creating commitment. Abandoning Petra would mean abandoning the massive investment in hydrology, leaving behind capability that could not be replicated elsewhere, water management technology that made this specific location valuable in ways that other sites could not match. Aretas understood this dynamic, or at least acted in ways that suggested understanding. His reign saw not just construction of infrastructure, but also development of institutions, administrative structures that were needed to manage settled population, courts and councils, tax collection and record keeping, governance mechanisms that were unnecessary for nomads, but essential for urbanites. The royal tombs, carved during his reign, marked another aspect of transformation. Permanent monuments to dead, rather than temporary markers that would be abandoned when camp moved, investment in memorialization that only made sense if descendants would remain nearby to honor ancestors, architecture of permanence rather than mobility. The facades themselves were statements, announcements to the world and to the Nabataeans themselves that they had changed, that they were no longer temporary residents but permanent inhabitants, that Petra was not camp but capital, that the transformation from nomadic to urban was complete and irreversible. The turning point was also commercial. Aretas's reign coincided with expansion of Nabataean control over trade routes, extension of influence northward into Syria and westward into Negev, development of subsidiary settlements that extended the network of water management and commercial infrastructure beyond Petra itself. The classical sources record conflicts during this period, tensions with the Hasmonean kingdom of Judea, disputes with Seleucid authorities in Syria, evidence that Nabataean expansion was generating resistance, that the transformation from traders to territorial power was creating political complications. But Aretas navigated these challenges successfully, maintaining commercial dominance while avoiding catastrophic military conflicts, using wealth to buy peace when necessary, demonstrating that Nabataean power rested on economic rather than military foundations, that control of trade was more valuable than control of territory. The transformation had costs. Urbanization created dependencies that nomadic life had avoided, concentration of population in single location created vulnerabilities. Reliance on infrastructure meant that failure of water systems or disruption of trade could cause catastrophe in ways that dispersed nomadic populations would have weathered more easily. The choice to settle was also choice to accept risk, to trade resilience of mobility for benefits of concentration, to commit to place and infrastructure in ways that would make the civilization both more powerful and more fragile, more capable of achievement and more vulnerable to disruption. But the benefits seemed to justify the risks. At least during Aretas's reign and for the century that followed, Petra flourished, population grew, wealth accumulated, monuments proliferated. The gamble on urbanization paid off spectacularly, creating prosperity that seemed to vindicate the transformation. The turning point was not just Nabataean but regional, occurring during a period of broader political reorganization in the Near East, as Seleucid power declined and Roman influence expanded, as old certainties dissolved and new opportunities appeared, as peoples throughout the region adapted to changing conditions. The Nabataeans' choice to urbanize and centralize positioned them to take advantage of these changes, to become players in regional politics rather than just desert traders, to negotiate with Rome and Judea and Egypt as equals rather than as marginal groups that could be ignored. Aretas corresponded with Roman officials, minted coins bearing Greek inscriptions alongside Nabataean, adopted titles and honours that proclaimed royal status according to Hellenistic conventions, presenting himself as legitimate monarch rather than tribal chieftain, claiming respect and recognition that nomadic leaders would never have received. The transformation was irreversible. Once committed to urban infrastructure and political centralization, the Nabataeans could not return to nomadic lifestyle. Their success created locks that prevented retreat, achievements that committed them to continuing what Aretas had begun. Future generations would build on his foundation, carving more elaborate tombs, extending water systems, developing additional settlements, expanding territory and influence. But the fundamental choice had been made during his reign, the decision to settle and centralize, to build permanent structures and develop urban civilization. When the Nabataeans eventually declined, when their cities were gradually abandoned and their culture disappeared, it would be partly because the transformation that Aretas initiated created vulnerabilities, because urban civilization dependent on infrastructure and trade could fail in ways that nomadic society could not, because commitment to place meant that environmental or economic changes could force abandonment. But that was for the future. During Aretas's reign and the golden age that followed, the turning point seemed entirely positive. The transformation from nomadic traders to urban civilization appeared as unqualified success, evidence that peoples could remake themselves, that desert could be conquered, that water and will and work could create flourishing where nature alone provided only desolation. The moment when everything changed was the moment when the Nabataeans chose to stay, when they committed to Petra not as temporary camp but as eternal city, when they built water systems and carved tombs that would outlast their civilization, when they transformed themselves, from wanderers into settlers, from Arabs of the desert into builders of the rose-red city that would become their monument and their mystery. The immediate consequence of the Nabataean transformation was prosperity beyond anything the desert had previously seen, a golden age that lasted roughly from the 1st century before the Common Era through the 1st century of the Common Era, when Petra's population reached its peak and Nabataean influence extended across a territory stretching from Damascus to the Red Sea. The city swelled with people. Estimates suggest 20,000 or more inhabitants at maximum, remarkable for a desert location with no natural advantages beyond strategic position, population sustained entirely by engineered water supply and commercial wealth, testament to how far human ingenuity could overcome environmental constraints. The valley floor filled with houses and workshops, markets and public buildings, the carved tombs in the cliffs representing only the elite dead, while the living occupied structures, built from more perishable materials, mud brick and wood that have since collapsed, leaving less dramatic traces than the stone facades, but indicating the true scale of urban development. The streets were paved, water flowed through ceramic pipes to fountains and public baths, Gardens flourished in impossible locations, where irrigation and terracing created green spaces. The desert city, demonstrating that wealth and engineering could create oases, that life could be comfortable, even in harsh environment. Trade caravans arrived constantly, camels loaded with frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia, with spices from India, with silk from the distant east, goods that would be stored in Petra's warehouses, taxed by Nabataean authorities, then transported onward to Gaza or Damascus, generating revenue at each stage, creating prosperity from position rather than production. The Nabataeans became middlemen on a grand scale, facilitators of commerce between regions that had little direct contact, translators not just of languages but of commercial practices and cultural expectations, merchants who understood both Arab suppliers and Mediterranean customers, who could negotiate in multiple contexts, who made themselves indispensable through expertise and reliability. The wealth flowed to the elite first, but trickled through the society, craftsmen producing pottery and metalwork, stonemasons carving tombs and temples, labourers maintaining water systems and constructing buildings, merchants managing shops and storehouses, priests maintaining temples, administrators keeping records, guards providing security, the urban economy creating employment and opportunity that nomadic life could never have offered. But the prosperity was dependent on conditions that the Nabataeans could influence but not control: the continued demand for aromatics in Mediterranean markets, the absence of alternative routes that would bypass Petra, the willingness of regional powers to allow Nabataean commercial dominance, the maintenance of water systems that required constant attention. The Golden Age was also the period of greatest cultural achievement, when Nabataean architects developed the distinctive styles that blended Hellenistic and Oriental elements, when pottery reached its highest quality, when inscriptions proliferated, as literacy spread beyond elite circles, when religious traditions were codified and temples established formal practices. The synthesis of influences that characterized Nabataean culture became most visible during this period: temples that incorporated Greek columns and Egyptian capitals, pottery that combined Arab forms with Hellenistic decoration, inscriptions that used Aramaic script to write Arabic language, creating hybrid aesthetic that was uniquely Nabataean. The kings of this period minted elaborate coins, struck treaties with Rome, corresponded with neighbouring rulers, behaved as equals of Hellenistic monarchs, claiming royal dignity and displaying wealth through building projects and diplomatic gifts, asserting Nabataean importance in regional politics. But the Golden Age contained seeds of future decline. The very success that made Petra prosperous created vulnerabilities: concentration of wealth and population in single location created attractive target for more powerful neighbours. Dependence on trade created exposure to economic shifts. Urban infrastructure required maintenance that became burden when revenues declined. The rise of Rome was particularly ominous. The expanding empire, gradually absorbing territories throughout the eastern Mediterranean, annexing kingdoms and transforming independent rulers into clients, extending influence through diplomatic pressure, backed by military force that dwarfed anything the Nabataeans could field. The Nabataean kings maintained independence through the first century of the Common Era by careful diplomacy, by avoiding conflicts, by presenting themselves as loyal allies rather than potential enemies, by providing services that Rome found useful, particularly controlling desert frontiers and maintaining trade routes. But this was temporary reprieve rather than permanent solution. Rome's appetite for annexation was insatiable. Its administrative logic demanded incorporation of prosperous regions into the empire. Its strategic thinking viewed independent kingdoms as eventual threats. Its patience with client states was finite. The consequence of Nabataean success was that they became too valuable to ignore, too wealthy to remain independent, too integrated into regional trade networks to be left outside Roman control, their prosperity making them target rather than protecting them. The Golden Age was also a period of maximum environmental stress. 20,000 people requiring water that was captured from limited rainfall, agriculture in marginal lands producing food that was barely adequate, any disruption to water systems or crop failures potentially catastrophic, the city operating at capacity with minimal resilience. Archaeological evidence suggests that maintaining water systems became increasingly difficult. Channels requiring frequent clearing of sediment, pipes needing replacement, cisterns demanding repairs, the infrastructure showing signs of strain, of systems pushed to their limits. The Golden Age was thus simultaneously high point and turning point, moment of greatest achievement and beginning of decline. Prosperity that was real but fragile. Success that created conditions for eventual failure. Rise that contained fall within it, like seed contains future plant. The Nabataeans, at their peak, controlled territory, wealth, and trade routes. They had transformed desert into garden, nomadic culture into urban civilization, themselves into players in regional politics. They had succeeded spectacularly at everything they had attempted. But they had also created civilization that was vulnerable in ways their nomadic ancestors had not been, dependent on infrastructure that could fail, on trade that could shift, on water that could run dry, on independence that powerful neighbours might choose to end, prosperity that was magnificent but precarious, golden age that shone brightly precisely because it could not last, rose-red city at its zenith, glorious and doomed, successful beyond any reasonable expectation but unable to sustain that success indefinitely against forces that were ultimately beyond their control. The impact of Nabataean civilization extended far beyond their relatively brief prominence, their innovations and achievements influencing subsequent cultures, their example demonstrating possibilities that others would build upon, their legacy surviving even as their distinctive identity disappeared. The most significant impact was technological, particularly in water management. The techniques developed to sustain desert cities, influencing later Islamic and Byzantine civilizations, providing models for how to survive and even thrive in arid environments. Knowledge that would be adapted and extended but that rested on foundations the Nabataeans had established. The Qanat systems used throughout the Islamic world, underground channels that transported water across desert regions, employed principles similar to those visible in Nabataean engineering, understanding of gradients and groundwater, of collection and distribution, of how to manage precious resource in scarce environments. Whether the later civilizations learned directly from Nabataean examples or independently developed similar solutions to similar problems remains debated, but the parallels are striking, suggesting either transmission of knowledge or convergence of technique driven by environmental necessity. The terracing and water harvesting methods, developed by Nabataeans in the Negev, influenced Byzantine agriculture in the same region, fields and farms established in late Roman and early Islamic periods, showing continuity with Nabataean practices, evidence that knowledge survived even when the civilization that created it disappeared. Modern Israeli efforts at desert agriculture have studied Nabataean remains, seeking to understand how ancient peoples sustained farming in marginal lands, applying recovered knowledge to contemporary challenges, demonstrating that innovations from 2,000 years ago remain relevant to present conditions. The impact on trade networks was profound. The Nabataeans established routes and commercial practices that outlasted their political independence, pathways across deserts that continued to be used long after Nabataean control ended, relationships between regions that they had connected remaining active under new management. The frankincense trade that made them wealthy continued flowing after Roman annexation, the same goods moving along the same routes but now administered by Roman authorities, Nabataean merchants, continuing their roles but as subjects rather than sovereign traders, their expertise still valuable even as their independence ended. The commercial networks they established, connecting Arabia to Mediterranean, east to west, created patterns of exchange that would persist through Byzantine and Islamic periods, trade relationships that became foundational to medieval commerce, routes that would eventually contribute to the Silk Road connections linking Asia and Europe. The cultural synthesis that characterized Nabataean civilization provided model for later Arab cultures, demonstrating that Arab identity was compatible with urban civilization, that desert peoples could build monumental architecture, that Arabic language could be written and sophisticated culture expressed through it. This was particularly important because it challenged Greek and Roman assumptions about Arab capabilities, providing counter-example to stereotypes about nomadic primitiveness. proving that Arabs could achieve everything their Mediterranean neighbours had, that they were not inherently inferior but simply different, operating in different environments with different traditions. The Nabataean script, though eventually replaced by other writing systems, influenced development of early Arabic scripts, the letterforms and conventions, contributing to evolution of writing systems that would eventually produce classical Arabic calligraphy. Linguistic bridge between Aramaic alphabets and distinctly Arab textual traditions. The architectural impact was subtle but real, the carved facades of Petra inspiring later rock-cut monuments in the region, influencing Byzantine church architecture in Jordan, providing templates for how to create impressive structures from living rock, techniques that would be applied to different purposes by different cultures, but that rested on Nabataean innovations. The concept of desert city, of urban civilization sustained by engineering rather than natural resources, would influence Islamic urban development. Cities like Baghdad and Cairo demonstrating that sophisticated urban culture could exist in arid regions, that technology and trade could overcome environmental limitations, examples that built on foundations the Nabataeans had laid. The impact on historical consciousness was more complex, the Nabataeans becoming symbol of lost civilization, of peoples who had thrived and then vanished, of the fragility of human achievement, their story serving as reminder that prosperity is temporary, that even successful civilizations can disappear, that monuments outlast the cultures that build them. Petra itself became UNESCO World Heritage Site, protected as global treasure, tourist destination attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, economic resource for modern Jordan, a symbol of national heritage and source of pride. The rose-red city continuing to generate revenue 2,000 years after the Nabataeans who built it disappeared. The impact on archaeology was significant. Petra demonstrating importance of understanding ancient peoples on their own terms, rather than through lens of classical sources, showing how oral traditions and nomadic cultures could achieve sophisticated urban civilization, challenging assumptions about necessary conditions for complexity. The Nabataean example influenced how archaeologists approached other desert civilizations, other marginal environments where peoples had succeeded against apparent odds, other cases where engineering and organization had overcome natural limitations, providing model for understanding how humans adapt to challenging conditions. The impact on modern understanding of climate and civilization was particularly relevant. The Nabataeans demonstrating that desert cities are vulnerable to environmental change, that dependence on sophisticated infrastructure creates fragility, that even successful adaptation can fail when conditions shift, lessons applicable to contemporary challenges. Current cities in arid regions, facing water scarcity and climate change, look to Nabataean remains for inspiration and warning, studying ancient water management, while recognizing that even sophisticated systems eventually failed, seeking to learn from both successes and failures, applying ancient knowledge to modern problems. The ultimate impact was perhaps philosophical, the Nabataeans proving that peoples could transform themselves, that nomadic Arabs could become urban sophisticates, that desert could be made habitable through will and work, that human ingenuity could overcome apparent natural limits, demonstrating possibilities while also revealing vulnerabilities, showing what could be achieved while reminding that all achievement is temporary, that the rose-red city stands, but the civilization that built it is gone, that stone endures while culture vanishes, that monuments survive while memory fades, legacy, preserved in fragments and ruins, in technologies adapted by others, in trade routes that outlasted traders, in impacts that rippled through centuries, even as the people who initiated them were forgotten and had to be rediscovered. Their story recovered from sand and stone by archaeologists piecing together evidence of what had been lost. Behind the monuments and the trade routes, behind the engineering marvels and the carved facades, there were people, individuals whose names occasionally survived in inscriptions, but whose lives could only be imagined from fragmentary evidence, whose humanity remains accessible through inference and empathy. There was a merchant whose tomb facade still stands in Petra's eastern cliff face, identified by inscription as a man named Uneshu, son of Khalidu, who died in the reign of King Aretas IV, who had accumulated enough wealth to commission elaborate carved monument, who wanted to be remembered but who left no other record of his life. Uneshu would have managed caravans, perhaps owned camels, or shares in trading ventures, would have travelled to southern Arabia to purchase frankincense, would have negotiated with producers and customers, calculated costs and profits, managed risks that could destroy fortunes as easily as create them. His days would have begun before dawn, checking manifests and inspecting goods, ensuring camels were properly loaded and caravans adequately supplied, consulting with guides about routes and water sources, making decisions that could mean success or disaster, life or death in the desert where mistakes were unforgiving. Perhaps he had family, wife, and children who lived in house with piped water and decorated pottery, who wore jewellery purchased with profits from successful ventures, who worried when caravans departed knowing some merchants never returned, that the desert claimed lives as well as fortunes. What did Uneshu think as he watched stonemasons carving his tomb, as the facade took shape in rock face visible from throughout the city, as his monument to immortality emerged from living stone? Did he believe the inscribed curse would protect him in death, that the gods would punish anyone who disturbed his remains, that his descendants would honour his memory for generations? The tomb stands, but Uneshu is forgotten. His wealth could not purchase the remembrance he desired, only the stone that bears his name, only the warning that no longer deters, only the monument that tourists photograph, without knowing or caring whose bones it once protected. There was an engineer whose name no inscription preserves, someone who designed the water systems that made the city possible, who calculated gradients and capacities, who understood hydrology without benefit of formal training or mathematical notation, who possessed knowledge that died with him. This engineer would have studied the landscape, traced wadis to their sources, observed where rain fell and how it flowed, understood which rock formations held water and which allowed seepage, knowledge acquired through experience and observation rather than through books or formal education. The channels carved into cliff faces were his text, the cisterns hewn from bedrock his monuments, the pipes that delivered water to houses his legacy, infrastructure that spoke his expertise, even though his name was never recorded, engineering that testified to capabilities that left no written explanation. Did he train apprentices, pass his knowledge to younger generation who would maintain what he designed? Or did his expertise die with him, leaving systems that functioned but that no one fully understood, infrastructure that worked until it failed and could not be properly repaired? There was a woman who managed a household, whose existence is suggested by domestic pottery and loom weights, by grinding stones and cooking vessels, by the fact that Nabataean households required management, and that in most ancient societies domestic management was women's work. She would have supervised servants, if wealthy enough to afford them, managed budgets and food supplies, raised children, and maintained social relationships, lived life that left minimal archaeological trace, but that was essential to urban civilization's functioning. Perhaps she had opinions about politics and religion, about the transformation from nomadic to urban life, about the monuments being carved and the temples being built, but her voice was not recorded, her thoughts not preserved, her experiences lost, except as statistical probability in demographic reconstruction. Did she remember nomadic past, hear stories from grandparents about tents and herds, about freedom of movement that urban settlement had replaced? Or was she generations removed from that life, fully adapted to Petra, unable to imagine living any other way? There was a priest who served in the temple of Dushara, who performed rituals prescribed by traditions that predated urbanization, who mediated between human and divine, who explained catastrophes and celebrated successes through theological frameworks that made sense of world. The priest's duties would have included sacrifices and prayers, maintenance of temple spaces, interpretation of omens, counseling of troubled congregants, all the functions that religious professionals perform across cultures, adapting ancient practices to urban contexts. What did the priests think about Hellenistic influences, about Greek names for Arab gods, about architectural styles borrowed from Mediterranean, about cultural synthesis that was creating something new? Did he see it as corruption of tradition, or creative adaptation, as loss or gain, as betrayal of ancestors or service to contemporary needs? The inscriptions he might have written survive only as formulaic texts, dedications and warnings, religious language that revealed beliefs but concealed the person, voice that spoke but did not truly communicate, across the centuries. There was a stonemason whose chisel marks still show in Petra's facades, whose technical skill created the monuments that define the city, whose artistry required years of training and physical strength, whose work was dangerous and demanding. The mason would have worked suspended by ropes, dangling against cliff face, chipping away stone with iron tools, creating columns and capitals from solid rock, following designs provided by architects, but applying his own expertise to execute them properly. His hands would have been calloused, his shoulders scarred from where ropes cut into flesh, his vision strained from years of close work in bright sunlight reflecting from red stone, his hearing damaged by constant hammering, occupational hazards that all ancient craftsmen endured. Did he take pride in his work? Did he step back at day's end to admire progress on facade? Did he imagine that his carvings would survive millennia, that his skill would be recognized by peoples who knew nothing else about him, that his anonymous labor would become world-famous monument? There was a child who played in Petra's streets, who fetched water from public fountain, who attended school if family was wealthy enough, who learned to read and write Nabataean script, or remained illiterate, depending on circumstances of birth. The child experienced the city not as archaeological sites but as home. The carved tombs were not monuments, but familiar landmarks. The water channels were not engineering marvels but infrastructure taken for granted. The trade caravans were not historical phenomena, but ordinary background of daily life. What became of that child? Did they live to see Petra's decline, to experience the gradual abandonment, to leave the city that had been their entire world? Or did they die young, as most ancient children did, their potential never realized, their story ending before it truly began? These were the forgotten voices, the people without monuments, without written records that preserved individual existences, whose humanity survives only in aggregate, as populations studied by demographers, as labourers assumed by archaeologists, as inferences from material culture that testifies to their presence while concealing their identities. They lived the history that became archaeology, experienced the transformation that became academic subject, built the monuments that became tourist destination. They were the Nabataeans, not abstractions but individuals, not statistics but persons, their voices forgotten but their humanity undeniable. Their names lost, but their presence preserved in every carved facade, every water channel, every fragment of pottery, every architectural achievement that required their labour, their knowledge, their lives that were lived and ended and survived only as traces that patient investigation could recover and respectful imagination could honour. The Nabataeans did not rise unopposed. Their success in controlling trade routes and accumulating wealth created enemies who sought to break their monopoly, to seize their territory, to replace them as middlemen, to profit from commerce they had dominated for centuries. The Hasmonean kingdom of Judea was among the first major challengers, Jewish rulers who expanded their territory in the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, who sought access to trade routes and Red Sea ports, who viewed Nabataean dominance of southern approaches as obstacle to their own commercial ambitions. The conflicts were intermittent rather than continuous. Raids and counter-raids, temporary alliances and broken treaties, the kind of frontier warfare that characterized relationships between ancient kingdoms competing for resources and influence, violent but not catastrophic, disruptive but not decisive. King Alexander Jannaeus of Judea besieged several Nabataean towns in the early 1st century, attempting to extend Jewish control eastward, forcing Nabataean king Obodas I to respond militarily, battles that ended in Nabataean victory, but that demonstrated the vulnerability of desert cities to determined sieges. The opposition from Judea was ultimately limited by logistics. Jewish armies could raid Nabataean territory, but could not conquer and hold it. The desert was too harsh, the distances too great, the Nabataean knowledge of terrain and water sources too advantageous for defenders, making permanent conquest impractical, even when temporary victories were possible. The Seleucid Empire posed different kind of threat during its period of power in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era, claiming sovereignty over territories that included Nabataean trade routes, demanding tribute and attempting to impose administration, backing these demands with military force that the Nabataeans could not directly challenge. But Seleucid authority was theoretical more than practical in desert regions. Their administrators could not effectively govern peoples who could simply move deeper into deserts when pressure increased, who could evade rather than resist, who could wait for imperial attention to shift elsewhere, as it inevitably did. The Nabataeans survived Seleucid period by combination of compliance and evasion, paying tribute when necessary, withdrawing when threatened, maintaining core autonomy while avoiding confrontations they could not win, demonstrating political flexibility that served them better than military strength would have. The greatest opposition eventually came from Rome, the expanding empire that gradually absorbed all the Near East, that transformed independent kingdoms into provinces, that possessed military power the Nabataeans could not hope to match, that viewed independent states as temporary anomalies to be corrected through annexation. Roman pressure built gradually over more than a century, beginning with diplomatic contacts in 1st century before the Common Era, evolving through various forms of client relationships, eventually culminating in direct annexation in 106 of the Common Era, process that the Nabataeans could slow but not prevent. The Nabataean kings attempted to maintain independence through diplomacy, presenting themselves as loyal allies, providing services Rome found useful, controlling desert frontiers and Arab tribes, maintaining trade routes and ensuring stability, making themselves valuable enough that annexation seemed unnecessary. King Aretas IV, who reigned from approximately 9 before the Common Era to 40 of the Common Era, was particularly successful at managing Roman relationship, maintaining cordial correspondence with emperors, avoiding conflicts, demonstrating that Nabataean kingdom could coexist with Roman interests. But Roman logic was inexorable. Valuable allies were also valuable acquisitions. Territories that generated revenue outside the empire were territories that should be generating revenue within it. Independent kingdoms were potential future threats that prudent administration demanded eliminating before they could cause problems. The final annexation under Emperor Trajan was peaceful, accomplished without significant military resistance. The last Nabataean king, Rabble II, apparently negotiated terms that protected elite interests in exchange for accepting provincial status, transformation accomplished through diplomacy rather than conquest. But this peaceful incorporation was itself a form of opposition success. The Nabataeans lost independence, not because they were defeated, but because resistance was futile, because Rome could not be opposed by military force and could not be evaded indefinitely, because the choice was between accepting terms or being conquered, and accepting terms seemed preferable. Natural forces provided constant opposition. The desert environment that made Nabataeans necessary also made their civilization precarious, dependent on water systems that required maintenance, on trade routes that could be blocked by storms or political instability, on conditions that they could manage but not control. Earthquakes periodically damaged infrastructure, bringing down buildings and breaking water pipes, requiring repairs that consumed resources and disrupted urban life. Environmental disasters that no engineering could prevent, only mitigate and recover from. The gradual climate changes that occurred during Roman period, subtle shifts in rainfall patterns, slight increases in aridity, changes that were barely perceptible within individual lifetimes, but that accumulated over generations, making water systems increasingly strained, agriculture more marginal, city more vulnerable to disruptions. Trade route competition emerged as greatest long-term threat. Development of Red Sea maritime commerce created alternative pathways for goods moving between Arabia and Mediterranean, ships that could carry more cargo more safely than camel caravans, that bypassed Petra entirely, that rendered the desert routes less profitable and eventually obsolete. The Nabataeans attempted to adapt, developing their own Red Sea port at Ayla, modern Aqaba, participating in maritime trade, diversifying economic foundation, but they could not recapture the monopoly they had enjoyed over overland routes, their competitive advantage eroded by technological change they could not prevent. The economic opposition was ultimately more devastating than military threats. Petra's prosperity had rested on specific conditions, control of specific routes, provision of specific services. When those conditions changed, when routes shifted, when services were no longer needed, the foundation of urban civilization crumbled. The opposition revealed the fundamental vulnerability of Nabataean success. They had thrived by making themselves indispensable, by providing services others needed, by controlling resources others required. But indispensability was conditional, dependent on circumstances that could change, on needs that could be met differently, on monopolies that technology or politics could break. When the conditions that had made them successful changed, when Rome no longer needed independent allies, when ships replaced caravans, when trade found other routes, when water systems became too expensive to maintain, the opposition won not through conquest but through irrelevance, not through force but through alternatives, not through destroying Nabataean civilization but through making it unnecessary, leaving the rose-red city standing but empty, monuments surviving but culture disappearing, facades remaining as tombstones for the civilization that carved them. Opposition's final victory complete, precisely because it required no violence, no dramatic defeat, only the quiet triumph of time and change, and conditions beyond human control. The peak of Nabataean civilization, roughly from the late 1st century, before the Common Era through the 1st century of the Common Era, represented not just material prosperity but a cultural renaissance, a period when the synthesis of Arab, Hellenistic, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian influences reached its most sophisticated expression. The artistic achievement was visible in pottery that achieved new heights of technical refinement, vessels so thin they were almost translucent, decorated with painted designs that combined geometric precision with flowing natural motifs. Production that required specialized workshops, trained craftsmen, and clientele wealthy enough to afford luxury goods. The painters who decorated these vessels were artists, not just craftsmen, their brushwork showing individual style within conventional patterns, innovations that pushed boundaries while respecting traditions, creativity that worked within established frameworks to produce objects that were functional but also beautiful, everyday items elevated to art. The architectural Renaissance was most visible in the royal tombs, the elaborate facades that became increasingly complex and ornate, incorporating multiple stories, combining different architectural orders, adding sculptural elements that created visual narratives, monuments that announced not just wealth but cultural sophistication. The urn tomb, the silk tomb, the Corinthian tomb, each represented evolution in design, experimentation with forms, increasing confidence in blending influences, facades that were simultaneously Arab and Hellenistic, traditional and innovative, distinctively Nabataean precisely because they were hybrid, synthesis that created something new from borrowed elements. The sculptors who carved these facades demonstrated remarkable skill, their work showing understanding of classical proportions and Arab decorative traditions, their chisels creating columns that appeared freestanding, though carved from solid rock, capitals that incorporated acanthus leaves and eagle motifs, pediments that combined Greek forms with Oriental symbolism. The religious Renaissance involved systematization of practices, construction of major temples, codification of rituals, development of priestly hierarchies, transformation of traditional Arab worship into urban religious institution, adaptation that maintained core beliefs while adopting organizational forms from Hellenistic models. The Temple of Qasr al-Bint, Petra's main religious structure, exemplified this synthesis, its plan following Near Eastern traditions of sacred space, its decoration incorporating Hellenistic motifs, its rituals blending Arab practices with imported ceremonial, creating worship that honored Dushara and Al-Uzza in ways that were both traditional and transformed. The inscriptions from this period showed literary development, texts becoming longer and more elaborate, language more sophisticated, formulas more complex, evidence of intellectual culture that extended beyond mere record-keeping to include literary expression, philosophical reflection, theological articulation. Some inscriptions were poetry, verses carved into stone, celebrating deceased or praising gods, showing that Nabataeans had developed literary traditions, that they created not just functional texts but aesthetic ones, that language was medium for artistic expression as well as practical communication. The Renaissance extended to urban planning, Petra showing evidence of organized development, streets laid out in patterns, public spaces designated, zoning that separated residential from commercial areas, infrastructure planned rather than haphazard, urbanism that demonstrated administrative sophistication. The colonnaded street that ran through city centre was product of this planning, Roman in its general conception but Nabataean in its execution, integrating with local topography and water systems, creating public space that facilitated commerce and social interaction, architecture serving community needs. The Renaissance was also commercial, Nabataean merchants operating across vast territories, maintaining trading houses in distant cities, establishing networks that connected Arabia to Mediterranean, to Mesopotamia, to Egypt, to India, commercial empire that existed alongside but independent of political boundaries. Nabataean pottery appeared in Egyptian Alexandria, in Syrian Antioch, in Arabian ports, in Mesopotamian cities. Physical evidence of commercial reach, proof that Nabataean goods and merchants travelled widely, that their culture was known far beyond their core territory. The merchant colonies maintained Nabataean identity while adapting to local conditions, speaking multiple languages, following different customs as needed, demonstrating cultural flexibility that served commercial purposes, cosmopolitanism that was pragmatic rather than philosophical, adaptation that was strategic rather than abandonment of identity. The Renaissance involved educational development. Evidence suggests schools where scribes were trained, where children of elite learned to read and write Nabataean script, where commercial and administrative skills were taught, institutions that transmitted knowledge across generations. The widespread literacy indicated by inscriptions throughout Nabataean territory suggested that education extended beyond elite circles, that merchants and craftsmen needed writing for business purposes, that literacy had practical applications that made it valuable enough to invest in education broadly rather than restricting it narrowly. The cultural confidence visible in the Renaissance, the willingness to borrow and adapt, to experiment and innovate, to create hybrid forms that respected traditions while pushing boundaries, reflected security and prosperity, belief that the future would be better than past, optimism that material success justified and enabled cultural achievement. But the Renaissance also contained seeds of eventual decline. The confidence was justified only as long as conditions that sustained it continued. The cultural flowering depended on economic foundation that was ultimately fragile. The sophistication required maintenance of infrastructure and institutions that became vulnerable when revenues declined. The Renaissance was a moment when Nabataean civilization expressed itself most fully, when the transformation from nomadic traders to urban sophisticates was complete and successful, when the rose-red city was at its most glorious, when culture and commerce and engineering and art all reached peaks that justified the risks that urbanization had entailed. It was awakening to what was possible, realization that desert Arabs could achieve everything their Mediterranean neighbors had, that cultural synthesis could create something uniquely valuable, that the choice to settle and build and invest in permanent civilization had been vindicated by prosperity and achievement, moment of cultural self-awareness and pride, flowering that announced Nabataean civilization had arrived. That they were no longer traders playing margins, but creators of culture worthy of respect and emulation. That the rose-red city was not just wealthy but sophisticated, not just functional but beautiful, not just surviving but thriving, demonstrating that human will and ingenuity could create flourishing even in harshest environments, that cultural renaissance could bloom in desert as surely as in more favoured regions, awakening that was magnificent and temporary, glorious and doomed, peak from which only decline was possible, but that was worth achieving for its own sake, a moment when Nabataean civilization was fully itself and most alive, before time and change and forces beyond control would gradually erode what had been built, leaving only stones to testify to the awakening that had occurred here, in the desert, among people who had transformed themselves and their world. The deepest truth about the Nabataeans is not that they built an impressive city in the desert, or that they controlled lucrative trade routes, or that they created hybrid culture, blending multiple influences, though all these things were real and remarkable. The deepest truth is that the Nabataeans succeeded not through force, but through service, not by conquering, but by facilitating, not by dominating, but by making themselves indispensable, demonstrating that power in the ancient world could come from sources other than military might, that wealth could be accumulated without imperial conquest, that civilizations could thrive by filling necessary roles rather than by subjugating neighbors. This was unusual in the ancient Near East, a region where most successful states were empires built through military expansion: Egypt and Assyria and Persia and later Rome. Civilizations that grew wealthy by extracting tribute from conquered territories, that demonstrated power through armies and fortifications, that measured success in lands controlled and peoples subjugated. The Nabataeans built no empire, conquered no peoples, extracted no tribute from territories they did not inhabit. Their power was commercial rather than military, based on control of routes rather than lands, sustained by knowledge and service rather than by force. They succeeded because they provided something others needed and could not easily obtain elsewhere: safe passage through deserts that were hostile to those who did not know them, water at locations where natural sources did not exist, security for valuable cargoes crossing vulnerable territories, knowledge of routes and conditions that could not be learned without years of experience. The classical sources that described them as tent-dwelling nomads captured something essential. Their success grew from desert adaptation, from knowledge that could only be acquired through living in harsh environments, from skills that settled urban peoples did not possess, from willingness to endure conditions that others avoided. When they urbanized, when they built Petra and carved facades and developed water systems, they did not abandon this foundation but built upon it. Desert knowledge remained their competitive advantage, their connection to nomadic past their source of commercial strength. Urbanization enhanced, rather than replaced, what had made them valuable. The revelation challenges assumptions about civilization and progress. The idea that success requires abandoning traditional ways, that sophistication demands rejection of origins, that urban development means cultural transformation that severs connections to past. The Nabataeans demonstrated that peoples could transform while maintaining identity, could adopt new practices while preserving essential traditions, could build cities without ceasing to be Arabs, could carve Hellenistic facades while worshipping Arab gods, could write in Aramaic script while speaking Arabic language. The synthesis they achieved was not confused mixture but deliberate selection, borrowing what served their purposes, adapting what fit their needs, maintaining what defined their identity, creating culture that was cosmopolitan without being derivative, sophisticated without abandoning roots. This cultural flexibility was itself a form of power. Merchants who could operate across cultural boundaries, who could speak multiple languages and follow different customs, who could be Arab in Arabian markets and Hellenized in Mediterranean cities, who translated not just goods but cultural expectations, making themselves indispensable as intermediaries. The deeper revelation concerns the nature of their disappearance, the fact that they vanished not through catastrophic defeat, but through gradual irrelevance, not because they were conquered, but because conditions changed, not because they failed at what they attempted, but because what they succeeded at ceased to matter. Roman annexation in 106 of the Common Era was peaceful, elite Nabataeans received citizenship, cities continued functioning, no mass slaughter or enslavement occurred. Incorporation into empire was administrative change rather than cultural catastrophe. But within few generations, Nabataean distinctiveness disappeared, language replaced by Greek and Latin, pottery styles supplanted by Roman wares, religious practices absorbed into Roman pantheon, script abandoned, identity eroded not through suppression but through assimilation. The revelation is about fragility of cultures dependent on specific conditions. The Nabataeans thrived because they controlled desert trade routes. When maritime commerce developed alternative pathways, when Roman roads provided easier overland access, when the conditions that made them necessary changed, their economic foundation crumbled and their cultural vitality could not survive the loss of prosperity. This pattern repeats throughout history. Civilizations built on particular technologies or resources or trade routes becoming obsolete when innovations emerge, when alternatives develop, when the advantages that sustain them evaporate. Success, creating dependencies that become vulnerabilities when circumstances shift. The revelation extends to understanding how knowledge is lost. The Nabataean water engineering was sophisticated but practical, existing in physical systems and in training of craftsmen rather than in written manuals, transmitted through apprenticeship rather than textbooks, knowledge that could be forgotten when practitioners died or dispersed. When Petra's population declined, when maintenance of water systems became economically unviable, when fewer craftsmen were trained in traditional techniques, the knowledge gradually disappeared. Channels filled with sediment, pipes broke and were not replaced, cisterns collapsed. Within few generations, no one remembered how the systems had been built or how they functioned. The loss was not deliberate suppression, but natural erosion. Knowledge that was not written down could not be recovered from texts. Skills that were not practiced were not preserved. Understanding that existed only in community of practitioners vanished when that community dispersed. The revelation about monuments and memory shows that stone outlasts culture, that the carved facades survived but the civilization that made them was forgotten, that physical remains can persist for millennia while the meanings they held for their creators are lost, that what tourists photograph is residue not essence, shell without substance, monuments separated from the memories that gave them significance. For the Nabataeans who carved the facades, these were not just tombs, but connections to ancestors, not just architecture but theology, not just display but genuine expressions of belief about death and afterlife, meanings that were real and important, but that could not be encoded in stone, that required living tradition to maintain, that died when the culture died even though the monument survived. The deepest truth is about the limits of what endures. Physical structures outlast the knowledge that created them. Monuments survive the memories they were meant to preserve. Stones speak, but in languages that must be recovered before they can be understood. Civilizations leave traces but not full records, presence but not understanding. The Nabataeans succeeded spectacularly at adapting to harsh environment, at building where building seemed impossible, at creating wealth from position rather than resources, at synthesizing cultures without losing identity. Their achievement was real and their capabilities were impressive. But they also demonstrated that success creates vulnerabilities, that specialization in particular niche makes civilization dependent on conditions maintaining, that knowledge transmitted practically rather than textually can be lost completely, that cultures can disappear even when their monuments endure. The revelation is that the rose-red city is both triumph and warning, evidence of what humans can achieve and reminder of how completely achievements can be forgotten, monument to success and testament to fragility, proof that civilization is always conditional, always dependent on factors beyond complete control, always vulnerable to changes that can render even sophisticated cultures obsolete. The Nabataeans built magnificently but temporarily, created brilliantly but precariously, succeeded wonderfully but unsustainably, their story revealing truths about power and knowledge, about adaptation and vulnerability, about memory and forgetting, about the difference between what survives in stone and what is lost when living traditions end. Deepest truth being that all human achievement is provisional, that success is never permanent, that the rose-red city standing empty is more eloquent than any text about the nature of civilization and the certainty of change. The story of the Nabataeans, recovered from sandstone cliffs and scattered inscriptions, holds up a mirror to our own time, reflecting questions about sustainability and specialization, about the fragility of civilizations dependent on specific conditions, about what endures and what is lost when cultures disappear. We live in an age of specialization, of economies built on narrow competitive advantages, of cities that exist because they provide specific services or control particular resources, of prosperity that depends on maintaining conditions that are ultimately beyond complete control, patterns that echo Nabataean experience in ways that should make us uncomfortable. The reflection asks whether our own civilization is more resilient or merely larger than theirs, whether our technology provides genuine security or just more elaborate ways of depending on conditions that could change, whether our knowledge will survive if our institutions fail, or whether it too will be lost like Nabataean. Hydraulic engineering. Modern cities in desert regions face challenges the Nabataeans would recognize. Dependence on water systems that require constant maintenance and enormous energy inputs. reliance on technologies that must function continuously or catastrophe ensues, vulnerabilities that are hidden during normal operations but revealed during disruptions. Las Vegas, Phoenix, Dubai, cities built in deserts through engineering that makes the impossible routine that sustains millions, where nature alone would support thousands, demonstrate that humans can still build where building seems unreasonable, but they also demonstrate continuing dependence on infrastructure and resources, on conditions maintaining, on assumptions about future resembling present. The Nabataean example suggests that such cities are magnificent but precarious, that their sustainability is not guaranteed by current success, that changes in economics or politics or environment could render them as obsolete as Petra, that future archaeologists might study their ruins and wonder why we built in places that were fundamentally unsuitable for large populations. The reflection extends to questions about economic specialization, the way modern economies depend on specific industries or resources, on competitive advantages that are conditional rather than permanent, on niches that can disappear when technologies change or alternatives emerge. Detroit's rise and decline mirrors Nabataean pattern, city that grew wealthy, providing something others needed, automobiles rather than desert passage, prosperity built on specific industry, success, creating dependencies that became catastrophic when conditions changed, when competition emerged, when what had been necessary became optional. The coal mining regions, the Rust Belt, the communities built around industries that declined, all demonstrate that economic foundations can erode, that specialization creates vulnerability, that the Nabataean lesson about dependence on specific conditions applies broadly, that modern technology does not eliminate these patterns but merely changes their specifics. The reflection on knowledge transmission is particularly relevant. The Nabataeans lost sophisticated engineering knowledge because it existed primarily in practice rather than in texts, in communities of practitioners rather than in written records, raising questions about what modern knowledge might be similarly vulnerable. Much contemporary expertise is similarly practical, existing in the minds and skills of practitioners rather than in documentation, transmitted through apprenticeship and experience rather than through formal education, knowledge that could be lost if communities of practice disappear or if transmission is interrupted. The specialized knowledge required to maintain modern infrastructure, to operate complex systems, to manufacture sophisticated technologies, often exists in relatively few individuals or organizations, creating vulnerabilities that are masked by routine functioning but that could be revealed by disruptions. The COVID pandemic demonstrated this fragility. Supply chains that seemed robust proved brittle. Knowledge concentrated in specific locations became inaccessible when travel was restricted. Just-in-time efficiency that worked under normal conditions created shortages during disruption, revealing that modern systems are optimized for stability but vulnerable to shocks. The reflection on cultural memory suggests that even well-documented civilizations can be forgotten or misunderstood, that physical monuments can survive while meanings are lost, that future generations might study our ruins without comprehending what we valued or believed, that stone outlasts culture even in age of digital archives. Digital information seems permanent, but is actually fragile, dependent on storage media that degrade, on file formats that become obsolete, on technologies that must be maintained or data becomes unreadable, creating possibility that future archaeologists will have less access to our records than we have to Roman or medieval sources that were carved in stone or written on parchment. The Nabataean example of cultural disappearance warns that assimilation can erase identity without violence, that peaceful incorporation can lead to loss as complete as conquest, that distinctive cultures can vanish not through suppression but through gradual abandonment of practices that seem less relevant or rewarding than alternatives. This has implications for contemporary cultural preservation, for indigenous peoples and minority communities whose languages and traditions face erosion not through oppression but through choices individuals make about which cultural practices to maintain and which to abandon, slow disappearance that seems voluntary, but that results in losses that are mourned once they become irreversible. The reflection on monuments and meaning shows that what survives is not necessarily what matters, that the carved facades which make Petra famous were not what made Nabataean civilization successful, that the visible remains can mislead us about what was important, that we might be building monuments that will outlast our culture while failing to preserve what truly matters. Our skyscrapers and infrastructure will endure as ruins, but will future peoples understand what we valued, what we believed, what motivated us? Will they be able to reconstruct our culture from physical remains, or will they see only shells without comprehending the meanings that animated them? The reflection on sustainability forces uncomfortable questions about how long current arrangements can continue, whether the global trade networks that sustain modern prosperity are robust or fragile, whether the technologies we depend on can be maintained indefinitely, or whether they contain vulnerabilities that will reveal themselves only when conditions change. The Nabataeans succeeded for 500 years, which seemed permanent to those living through it, but which in historical perspective was brief episode. Their prosperity dependent on conditions that shifted, their specialization creating vulnerabilities that eventually proved fatal. How long can our arrangements endure? Are we building for permanence or creating elaborate temporary structures that will be abandoned when conditions change? Are we preserving knowledge that will enable adaptation or becoming dependent on systems that will fail catastrophically when stressed? The reflection from Petra is ultimately about humility, about recognizing that human achievement is always conditional, that success creates dependencies that become vulnerabilities, that what seems permanent can prove temporary, that civilizations more sophisticated than ours have disappeared, leaving only monuments that we struggle to interpret. What it means for us is this: the rose-red city is both inspiration and warning, evidence that humans can accomplish remarkable things in unlikely places, and reminder that accomplishments do not guarantee permanence, proof of capability and testament to fragility, monument to success that is also memorial to disappearance. The reflection asks whether we will learn from Nabataean example, whether we will build more resilient systems, preserve knowledge more durably, create cultures less dependent on specific conditions, or whether we will repeat their patterns, specializing brilliantly but precariously, succeeding temporarily but unsustainably, building monuments that will outlast the civilization that creates them, leaving future peoples to study our ruins and wonder why we did not heed warnings that were written in stone in a rose-red city that still stands in the desert, silent and eloquent, abandoned and preserved, monument and warning, achievement and caution, story that continues beyond its ending, speaking still to those willing to listen about what endures and what is lost, about civilization's fragility and humanity's persistence, about the difference between building and preserving, about stones that survive and knowledge that vanishes, about success that is magnificent but temporary, triumph that contains within it the seeds of its own ending. The facades stand still in the rose-red cliffs, carved from sandstone that glows pink in dawn light and deepens to crimson at sunset, colours shifting with the hours as sun tracks across the sky, illuminating surfaces that have watched the desert for 2,000 years. Tourists arrive daily, emerging from the Six narrow passage to see the treasury revealed suddenly, experiencing the same astonishment that Burckhardt felt 2 centuries ago, the same wonder that the monuments have provoked in every visitor since their rediscovery, stone's power to impress, undiminished by time or familiarity. The guides tell stories, some accurate, some embellished, mixing archaeological knowledge with local legend, showing visitors the royal tombs and the Roman theatre, the monastery perched on distant cliff, requiring hours of climbing to reach, the high place of sacrifice, where ancient priests performed rituals whose meanings are now uncertain. The city has become Jordan's most valuable tourist attraction, generating revenue that supports local communities, creating employment for guides and merchants, providing economic incentive for preservation. The ancient stones still creating wealth, though, through entirely different mechanisms than the Nabataeans employed. But the tourists see only fragments, the carved facades divorced from the civilization that created them, monuments separated from the meanings they held for those who commissioned them, architecture without the cultural context that gave it significance, stones that speak but in language that requires translation and interpretation. The archaeologists continue their work, each season bringing new excavations, new surveys, new applications of technology that reveal features invisible to earlier researchers. ground-penetrating radar showing structures still buried, three-dimensional scanning documenting facades before erosion claims more detail, chemical analysis extracting information from pottery and plaster. Each discovery adds to understanding but also raises new questions, revealing how much remains unknown, how many sites are still unexcavated, how many inscriptions await translation, how much evidence has been lost to erosion and human disturbance, how incomplete the picture remains despite more than 2 centuries of investigation. The Jordanian authorities balance preservation and access, tourism and archaeology, allowing visitors while trying to protect fragile remains, managing site that is simultaneously national heritage and global treasure, economic resource and archaeological laboratory, sacred space for some and secular monument for others. The tensions are ongoing, the desire to share Petra with the world conflicting with need to protect it from damage that visitors inevitably cause, the economic benefits of tourism creating pressures that threaten the very features that attract interest, preservation requiring restrictions that reduce accessibility. The legacy in stone is slowly eroding. Wind and rain wearing surfaces, temperature fluctuations causing expansion and contraction that creates cracks, salt crystallization within the rock causing flaking and spalling, processes that are natural but accelerated by human presence, by touching and climbing, by water used for tourist facilities seeping into structures never meant to be wet. Conservation efforts attempt to slow deterioration, stabilizing facades, controlling drainage, limiting access to most fragile areas, applying treatments that protect surfaces without altering appearances, fighting against time and nature, trying to preserve for future generations monuments that are inevitably temporary, even if they survive millennia. The legacy and memory is more complex, the Nabataeans remembered but not fully understood. Their achievements recognized, but their motivations obscure, their culture acknowledged, but their voices distant and difficult to hear across the centuries. The modern interest in Petra often focuses on visual spectacle, on the photogenic qualities of carved facades, on the exotic appeal of desert ruins, on the romance of lost civilizations, tourists seeking images for social media, adventure travelers checking experiences off lists, pilgrims to secular monument rather than religious site. But some visitors engage more deeply, reading history, contemplating implications, recognizing that the stones testify not just to architectural skill, but to human capacity for adaptation and innovation, to possibilities that seem unlikely until accomplished, to civilizations that challenge assumptions about what is possible in harsh environments. The legacy extends to scholarship, Petra, remaining subject of ongoing research, conferences devoted to Nabataean civilization, journals publishing new findings, debates continuing about interpretation and meaning, the academic interest ensuring that the Nabataeans will not be forgotten again, that knowledge will continue accumulating, that understanding will deepen even if completeness remains elusive. The legacy also includes the modern communities descended from Bedouin, who knew of Petra's existence through the centuries when it was forgotten by others, whose oral traditions preserved memory of the ancient city, whose ancestors used the caves and facades for shelter, who now serve as guides and merchants, whose livelihoods depend on the tourism that their heritage enables. These communities claim connection to Nabataean past, emphasizing continuity across millennia, asserting that they are heirs to the civilization that built Petra, maintaining traditions that link them to ancient predecessors, though historians debate the validity of these claims, questioning whether continuous cultural transmission can be demonstrated or whether claimed connections are modern constructions. The question matters less than the fact that living peoples find meaning in Nabataean past, that the ancient stones remain relevant to contemporary identities, that heritage is not just archaeological but personal, that the rose-red city belongs not just to scholars and tourists, but to those who live near it and claim it as their own. The legacy is ultimately about persistence and loss, about what endures and what disappears, about monuments that survive when cultures vanish, about stones that speak when voices are silent, about presence that testifies to absence, about the gap between the impressive and the important, between what we can see and what we can understand. The Nabataeans built magnificently, carved facades that still astonish, engineered water systems that still impress, created wealth from position and knowledge, succeeded spectacularly at adapting to harsh environment, demonstrated that desert could be conquered through human ingenuity. But they also disappeared, their language forgotten, their knowledge lost, their culture absorbed, leaving only stones to mark where they had been, monuments that announce their presence while concealing their nature, legacy that is simultaneously substantial and insubstantial, visible and mysterious. The facades will stand as long as the sandstone endures, centuries more at least, possibly millennia, outlasting not just the civilization that carved them, but perhaps also the civilizations that study them, monuments that will witness human futures we cannot imagine, stones that will remain when languages and cultures and technologies that seem permanent to us have vanished as completely as the Nabataeans did. The legacy in stone and memory is a story that continues, incomplete and ongoing, about people who built in the desert and then disappeared, who succeeded, brilliantly but briefly, who left monuments that tourists photograph and scholars study, who created wealth and culture and magnificent architecture, who demonstrated human capacity for achievement and illustrated human vulnerability to change, whose rose-red city stands as testament to what was possible and warning about what is temporary, legacy written in sandstone that glows pink at dawn and crimson at sunset, changing with the light but enduring through the years, speaking still about civilization and adaptation, about success and disappearance, about building and forgetting, about stones that survive and cultures that vanish, about the mystery that remains even when monuments are rediscovered and studied and photographed and preserved, about the Nabataeans who carved facades into cliffs and then walked away, leaving behind stone and silence, presence and absence, achievement and enigma. The rose-red city half as old as time, standing in the desert, waiting for those who come to see and wonder, to admire and question, to photograph and study, to learn what they can from stones that speak, but do not tell everything, that reveal and conceal, that endure and crumble, that are simultaneously answer and question, monument and mystery, legacy that persists across millennia, Petra, eternal and temporary, substantial and insubstantial, known and unknown, the enigmatic achievement of a people who are forgotten, but whose stones remain.